Welcome back, everyone, to Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, John Webster, and with me is my wonderful co-host, Mr. Jared Kozel. How you doing, Jared?
I'm doing very well, man. I'm happy to be here, and we had, as I'm sure you'll go into, we had a little bit of a last-minute scheduling change, but we were hoping to have another face with us, our dear friend AR, but it seems like fate has decreed that not to be for today, so we will try to do our best in her absence.
Yeah, it was in. I always think of the Princess Bride when I say even I use this word, but it was inconceivable that to press forward with our Pirates of the Caribbean anniversary stream without the other lead member of the Knights of Kira. So we pushed it back. We will get to that in 2 weeks. Hi, Laura. Thank you.
Hey, Laura.
Um, yeah, we'll get back to that and do that in about 2 weeks because next week we have the return of Ahsoka that we'll be talking about, and we wanted to keep that to talking about episodes 3, 4, and 5 because episode 5 is going to be a doozy. For reasons that are apparent to anyone watching that show. But so we're going to keep that to next week. So we had to come up with something this week. And what else but something else Star Wars. So we had a couple ideas. You brought up Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which we will get to just as soon as it comes out on Blu-ray and 4K, because I do want to watch that again before we talk about it. So I suggested a favorite of ours, I think, Solo, a Star Wars story, which I feel is like unfairly is sort of like the middle child of the Star Wars franchise. It's just it is not loved enough, and I think it is a gem of the series. So that's sort of been in my mind for a long time that I'd like to do a stream on that, and no time like the present.
Yeah, you called it a gem. I was actually just thinking of that exact same word for it, whether it's an underrated gem or an undiscovered gem or an underappreciated gem. Take your pick, but I definitely feel like it is a movie that deserves better than it has received from both its release and its place in the culture, let's say. But there are people who do love it, and we are two of those people. So we are going to uh, wax poetic about it for as long as we can.
I mean, look at that poster. That is just the poster of a really special film and a very special Star Wars film. I love the retro feel of this. Um, it was funny because the hype was, shall we say, not there as as this movie was getting ready to come out, but everything like I, I didn't think the trailers were necessarily that great, and I do think that Lucasfilm struggled with the overall advertisement for especially these standalone Star Wars films, because it always felt like they were trying to almost pitch them as something they weren't at times. And I remember, especially the trailers for Rogue One, it always like it was obvious when I was watching those trailers that they were piecing together different pieces of dialogue. I mean, they do that all the time with advertisements, but it seemed particularly egregious with these. And but otherwise, like everything I saw, like I said, I love the look of what they were going for with like the posters, and I loved, the cast looked great, and to my mind, it had the potential to be a really fun Star Wars movie. And I guess that's kind of the way I am all the time with movies, where I kind of, sometimes it's unavoidable, but a lot of times I try to ignore that overall narrative that gets built up around a movie pre-release. And like, if I'm excited about something, I try and go into it with that frame of mind. And if I don't like it, I don't like it. But I try not to have that predetermined notion of what a movie is supposed to be. And this is going to be a bit of a lengthy aside, but I got to see this movie for the first time at an ArcLight cinemas. It was actually during or near the tail end of Con of Thrones 2018, when I was with my good friends, with my good friend Laura, who we all know, as well as some other another member of the Slack who isn't in it as much, Alex, and her husband Mike, and we kind of had like a group going on, and this was before I'd sort of fallen in with the full Here Be Dragons crew, and we had gone out bowling that night, and we were doing that really late. It was like the last night of the convention, and but I was like, I want to go see Solo, a Star Wars story. And this was at like, had to be like 12 o'clock at night or something like that. And it was going to start at, or maybe it might have been a little earlier, because but it was around that like 11:30, 12 o'clock. So there was going to be a midnight showing. And they looked at me, they were like, "Are you crazy? We have to go home tomorrow. It's late at night. We have to go home and sleep." And so I took a cab in this city that I didn't know. We were in Dallas, and I went to the ArcLight, and it was great because it's this sort of throwback theater with like old movie posters, and I got to like order a drink, and I'm not sure if I got food or not, but it was a whole vibe onto itself. And it was just completely by myself. Sat down, the lights went down pretty much from that first spark of when Han is starting up the, what would you call it? The vehicle.
Speeder.
Yeah. The speeder, yeah. Like, the movie had an energy about it that I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. And I had a big, stupid grin on my face for the whole 2 hours that followed. And I went back to my hotel room afterwards, and did I do the responsible thing? Did I go to sleep? No. I hopped on iTunes and bought the soundtrack. Then I listened to that straight through, and I was so excited about the movie. So okay, so that's kind of my origin story for seeing this. How about you?
Yeah, so just because you mentioned it, I want to kind of set the stage for why this movie eventually became the underrated and underappreciated gem that it is. And that was that it is kind of difficult to talk about this movie without getting lost, at least in the certain online sectors, about the production and marketing around this movie that led to it being underseen and deemed by some, quote unquote, a failure. The reason being for that, this movie came out 5 months after Star Wars The Last Jedi, which was, while we love it, was very controversial, and there had never been such a short gap between Star Wars movies ever. Also, the marketing for this movie did not start until February. I remember very clearly because I saw the first ever trailer for this movie during the Super Bowl, which was 3 months before a movie release, which is very rare for a studio tentpole. And part of the reason it took so long is because it's been well publicized that this movie was almost completely reshot after the original directors, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, were fired in the middle of the production and replaced by Ron Howard, which resulted in a massive budget increase for the movie. And all those factors kind of combined with the fact that the release date didn't move to December, which is a CEO of a certain struck company has freely owned up to admitting was a mistake. This movie did not make, it made money, but it did not make what was deemed enough money for a Star Wars movie to be considered successful. So people wrote it off. But the perhaps saving grace of it all is that the movie itself, really damn good.
It's utterly delightful.
Yeah. And what you talked about, but like setting aside expectations, I kind of feel like the reason people come to this and they feel like it's underrated is because they hear all that junk and they're like, well, all that movie must be a mess. And then if you actually watch it, a lot of times people are pleasantly surprised. And I feel like, you know, as a Star Wars diehard, I was obviously there opening night to see it. And I was aware of all those, you know, factors, but I put them all out of my mind. And I was rewarded with an incredible, you know, adventure. And I feel like that's the spirit that I take with me every time I watch this movie. It just feels like an adventure. I saw it 4 times in theaters, which, believe it or not, is not the most I've ever seen a Star Wars movie in theaters. That the record for that is 16 times for The Rise of Skywalker, followed by 5 for The Last Jedi. But I saw this movie like literally 2 consecutive days in a row just because I had such a good time with it that I wanted to go back and experience it again. And you mentioned it from the opening jump. You know, I specifically think about the fact that this one opens not with a crawl, but with a, you know, kind of a chyron that emulates the crawl and sets the stage. It really does feel like it's, you know, it's very grounded and assured in the story it wants to tell and the style in which it wants to tell it. It is somewhat unique among Star Wars movies in that it is arguably the only one of the 11 theatrical live-action movies in which the stakes of the fate of the galaxy is not at stake. Is not at stake, perhaps. But that allows it to tell a story that is both smaller in scope, but, you know, vast in scope and in its heart. And I feel like the messages of which it's telling, like trying to tell, are the universal Star Wars themes that we all love. So that's why I love this movie dearly.
Yeah, this is a story that now, oh, I'm getting a lot of echo. This is a story that nowadays would, like, you wouldn't even think twice. It would be a Disney Plus series at best. But the fact that at this point they were trying these kinds of stories on the large scale of the big screen, you looked at this and the movie just looks utterly fantastic. And it's a joy to my mind to see a smaller scale, you know, story told in this fashion. But I'm gonna take a sidestep just for a second, because despite the fact that I just less than a few minutes ago told you to remind me, you'd think I'd remember, but you mentioned about you know, the struck company. I want to make sure, as we did with the Ahsoka stream, that I mention, you know, talk about right now there's a little something going on, which is the WGA and SAG strikes. So I want to just state that, of course, like I did before, that, you know, we're very conscious of this, and we want people, if you're watching this, if you're enjoying this, please consider you know, supporting and donating to the unions. There's some links in the description of this video. We've got links to the Entertainment Community Fund, SAG-AFTRA financial assistance, the WGA Good and Welfare Emergency Assistance loans, And then there's another website called Think Tank for Inclusion and Equity, WA Strike Resources, which has a lot more links than I could read off right now. So please check those out and support the strikes. I think I stated this before, but the only reason I really feel comfortable doing this is because this is basically a very small channel in which we're talking to a few of our friends at best, usually. Hence why we're even doing this. But please do support the strikes in whatever way you can. So I just want to mention that, and now we can sort of get back into talking about, unless you want to mention anything real quick, Jared.
No, just the fact that we stand behind the writers and the actors who created this project 100%. Without them, this movie and all the other movies that we love, not only in the Star Wars galaxy, but all across, film and television, would not exist. And so we are, hoping ultimately for a resolution to the strikes that will be in their favor. It doesn't look like that's imminent anytime soon. So anything that you can do to show support for them, whether that's speaking out publicly or providing what financial assistance you can, if it's within your means to do so, it's something that I feel like is meaningful, and it is worthwhile, because these are the people who make the magic that makes our lives better. So
yeah. And it's interesting to talk about the strikes in relation to this film, because of course one of the things that's a big issue with the strikes is AI, and that's an interesting conversation in the use of AI with what this franchise in particular has been doing with certain characters, and and I have a preference for what this movie does, which was they go ahead and recast a new actor in an older role, versus and there's not to say that there's the thing with Luke and say the Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett is a complex issue, because there's a question of they're using it as a tool, the actors actually involved, and all that. So I think it's a lot more nuanced than perhaps we will even get into in this particular stream. But it's still an interesting topic, and looking at this movie and how it approached, that I don't think that was even necessarily a thought yet. They went ahead and were just like, well, yes, we need to find a young actor who can play Han Solo. And I think it's in part this sort of reaction to this movie that then has set off a sort of chain reaction of where Lucasfilm is kind of like, well, we can't try that again, which, is unfortunate. And I hope they have a change of heart on that note, because I absolutely love what Alden, brought to his performance of Han Solo in this. And I think I said when this movie came out and people were like, well, he's not Harrison Ford. I'm like, nobody's Harrison Ford. You could travel back in time and try Harrison Ford into the future, but that's the only way you're going to get that version of Han Solo, or of course the controversial way they're doing it with Luke. But I don't know. For myself, I prefer the truth and spontaneity of a real actor, on screen, embodying his own version of this character. And I like that he didn't just, do a, Harrison Ford impression, because that's just that sort of thing would be doomed to failure. and so I quite like this version of Han, and I'm still hoping we get to see more of it in the future.
Yeah, it's around a couple months ago, there was an article in one of the magazines with comments from Kathleen Kennedy, who I generally love and support, that were kind of discouraging about the prospect of the legacy characters such as Luke, Han, and Leia being recast. But for this movie, like, I hope I sincerely hope that's not the lesson that ultimately gets taken away from it, because that's not why this movie didn't do well at the box office. And if they had tried to do it the other way, I don't think it would have been successful either. The characters that have been created via CGI, deepfake AI on the television shows so far, or de-aging, are characters who have appeared in smaller roles and smaller supporting roles, and a lot of times they had the participation of the actual actor. Mark Hamill, was on set for Luke Skywalker. Hayden Christensen is on set for Anakin Skywalker. And so, it is a little bit more authentic than, a completely AI generated creation on top of a stand-in. But, that's not something that Harrison Ford was necessarily going to ever do for this movie. And so it had to be a younger actor, particularly for the demands of a shoot like this, where there's going to be a lot of action and excitement. And the choice of Alden Ehrenreich, I think it was brilliant for reasons we'll go into. Some people, I know that a very popular fan cast before this movie came out was one, I believe the actor's name is Anthony Gruber, who played a younger version of a Harrison Ford character in the movie The Age of Adeline, and does a very convincing Harrison Ford impression. And so when Alden Ehrenreich was cast, there was a popular reaction of, well, he doesn't look like young Han Solo. And if you watch the movie, you might say, well, he doesn't act how we expect Han Solo of the original trilogy to act. And to the first, I would say, so what? As long as he can convincingly embody the spirit of the character, and which I believe he does. And for the second, I would say that's the point. This Han Solo is not the Han Solo of the original trilogy. This movie is the story of how he gets to that point, or at least partially gets to that point.
It's almost like this takes place a whole decade before the other movies. Imagine that. And you see a lot of and you see the building blocks are there. He takes so many things from so many of the people he meets that are almost especially in the case of Woody Harrelson's character is like they have a complicated relationship throughout the movie, but it's almost like a father figure in a way of sort of, you can see him taking on certain personality aspects, as he goes along, and and then as the years progress, the thing he calls him kid throughout the movie, and then you see Han adopt that when he's talking to Enfys Nest, at the end of the film. And it's just, this is very early stages Han Solo, and and there is this thing called character growth.
Yes. Kind of important.
Yeah. But it's important to allow also for this actor to bring his own personality to a part. It doesn't do any good to just do a imitation, as we were talking about. It's those rarely work, in my opinion, and you have to let these actors create a version of the character that pays tribute to the original but is uniquely their own.
And the through line for me in addition to just this simple idea of, you know, narrative progression and character growth, it comes in the idea that, you know, this movie is written by Lawrence Kasdan alongside his son John, from a script that Lawrence Kasdan was very passionate about. This was one of the when Star Wars was originally sold to Disney, and George Lucas had provided, you know, a few ideas about potential films that they could make. This was one of those films, and this was one of the films that they were the most excited about because of Lawrence Kasdan, who was the credited screenwriter on, you know, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, in addition to Raiders of the Lost Ark, and is widely credited as being the man who essentially helped shape the Han Solo that the world fell in love with. Because Harrison Ford kind of leapt off the screen in A New Hope for very, very good reason, and in the character that George Lucas created. But it seems to be the general consensus, to the extent that Star Wars fans can agree on anything, that The Empire Strikes Back is the movie where Han Solo shines the most. And that's the film where Lawrence Kasdan really kind of injected a little bit of the edge that we love in Han into, you know, into that character. A lot of his most famous lines come from that movie, and a lot of those famous lines were written by Lawrence Kasdan. And you kind of feel like when Lawrence Kasdan decides he wants to write a movie about the young Han Solo, you know he's thinking about where Han eventually winds up. So when he sits down and writes this movie with his son, he knows that he has to start Han in a place where, in order to become that beloved, you know, scoundrel and eventually rebellion war hero in general that we all know and love, you know, in order for this movie to mean something, he needs to start in a very different place. And the place he chooses to start in is that Han is still confident, still skilled, still fast talking, still, you know, has that ultimate, you know, heart of gold that we really like. But the big difference is that he is more optimistic. He has not yet been, despite growing up in terrible circumstances on Corellia as a de facto orphan living with criminals, you can tell that he truly believes that he can make his own way in the galaxy. And he has Kira alongside him, and that their relationship in this movie, and I'm sure we will wax poetic extensively about how amazing and wonderful Emilia Clarke is in this particular role, but their relationship is something that it's probably the movie's greatest triumph, because the idea of giving Harrison Ford's giving Han Solo a love interest who isn't Princess Leia, one of the most beloved and famous characters in all of, you know, fiction, and that relationship would work, and that she would become a beloved character in her own right, that is a feat of screenwriting, a feat of acting performance, and just a feat of that you know, chemistry between them that you can't quantify, but you know it when you see it.
Well, this is why I wanted to make sure we gave Alden his due right off the bat, because it would be very easy for me to have this just slip into let's talk about Emilia Clarke for 2 hours as Kira, because she is so amazing in this. And yeah, it's like it's so great, and like their relationship is like a leaping off point to where I could talk about so many different things that are utterly amazing about this film. And you know, the fact that it really taps into this feeling of like old style, you know, movie screen romances, that, you know, like the theme that is written for them, the love theme by the great John Powell, is wonderful. You know, we've got like a sort of 50s style romance, you know, scene in a closet, you know, where, which is a scene directed by George Lucas, by the way. Um, and that just is like a throwback in every, you know, in every, you know, way imaginable. And just that they have a great chemistry, and the fact that, yeah, the fact that it works when, like, in our head we're thinking Han Solo and Princess Leia, they're the couple, and that we're rooting for these two throughout the film, and that our heart breaks at the end of the movie. We'll, you know, we'll talk more about that later, but it's just so so amazing. And yeah, it's just, I'm just rambling now because I'm just so in love with what they did with this. Um, but yeah, so anything more you want to say about, you know, before we kind of, you know?
Well, so what I mentioned that Han, you know, starts off in this very optimistic kind of place, and one of the ways that they show that is by having him be just genuinely, sweetly, head over heels in love with, you know, this young woman of Kira. No like illusions about the idea that, you know, this couldn't or maybe shouldn't work out. Just the idea that, like, no, we're together. We will always be together. You know, she is the reason I'm going to, you know, try to make my way in the galaxy, is so that we can live this life together. And Kira kind of starts in that same place herself, but very, very quickly we have the point where they are tragically and forcibly separated at the beginning of the movie, when he literally makes it through the gate to quote unquote freedom in a dangerous galaxy, and she doesn't. And she winds up in a very different situation, essentially becoming almost a prisoner. And she makes her own way in a very different way, and that experience, that life experience, shapes her perspective into one that is almost in the opposite of Han's, where they, you know, she becomes a much more guarded and cynical, if you could call it that, and, you know, cautious character. But you don't necessarily see it on the surface, because, you know, Emilia Clarke is still smiling that brilliant, beautiful smile of hers, and she's still laughing and joking. And it's like, and when they talk together, when they reunite, when they're on the adventure together, you feel like, oh, these two just, they're back. They're the same couple that we saw at the beginning, that they're in love and they're going to find their way to be together. But it really all comes down to that scene in the elevator when they're getting ready to go up and face Dryden Voss, and Han looks at her and he says, "We're going to win." And she looks at him and says, "It's not that kind of game, Han. The object isn't to win. It's just to stay in it as long as you can." And he retorts, "You don't know everything." And she's like, "Perhaps not, but just a bit more than you." And
really,
when you look back at the end, that scene is so important, so powerful, and so devastating, because it ultimately becomes a changing agent that causes Han to almost adopt that perspective until the events of the original trilogy, when he, you know, meets Luke and Leia, and the better angels of his nature come out once again. Because in another incredibly important scene, as Kira says, you know, to him earlier, "You are the good guy," and that never changes. And what's beautiful about it is that Kira knows that, and you can see that Kira still loves him for it. She just doesn't believe that that's possible for her, and it's, you know, incredibly heartbreaking that that's the case.
It's just making me think about, you know, this movie is just there's so much untapped potential from, you know, from this film where they could have leapt off to so many different places, and especially with the character of Kira. And I know there's been a lot of stuff with the comics that they've done, which I haven't gotten to because honestly, the comics are so spread out and have like different crossover things. I honestly never know where to start. So I go to the bookstore and I'm like, well, if I buy this collection, am I going to get the gist of it? Or what? So it's hard. And honestly, I want to see Emilia Clarke return, you know, and give us more of this character, whether that's, you know, if she voices it in animation, you know, that would be cool, but it'd be even better to get her back in live action. I always say I'm very conflicted about like seeing the stories with her and Maul because I love animated Maul, you know, via the Clone Wars and things like that. But I want Emilia Clarke in live action. So it's like, you know, but yeah, I hope they find a way to come back around to especially tell her story. I know that the Lando series is still, you know, something that's in development. I hope that sees the light of day because I want to see Donald Glover come back. Now he's a you know, an excellent example of a character where when he first appears on screen, he's doing a touch of a Billy D. Williams impression, but then once it sort of gets into it, that relaxes and he's allowed to very much do his own interpretation of the character. And and to single people out, it does a disservice to everybody else because I think this entire cast is just utterly phenomenal. But to the idea of actually not getting Donald Glover back and pursuing that avenue, it seems almost criminal. So I do hope that sees the light of day. It's just there's so many things juggling in the air, with Star Wars. It's just like I don't want it to be a few years down the line. I want to get it now, or at least when the strikes are over.
Yeah. No, I mean it's one of the things about this movie is that it works incredibly well as its own standalone entity within the larger Star Wars galaxy. Obviously, it benefits from, its relationship to the original trilogy and everything. But one of the tragedies about it is that it is so primed for a sequel of some kind. And whether or not that is, ultimately told in live action or in part via the Lando series, which Donald Glover is, I believe, now going to be writing as well as starring in if it ever comes to fruition, or if it's an animation. I just hope it comes to our screens because I personally feel like, I'm okay with Kira in the comics because it takes place, in the Empire Strikes Back / Return of the Jedi era, where all that really tells us is that she doesn't perish before then, and that also that she ultimately is successful in seizing control of Crimson Dawn, and Maul at some point winds up in exile. However, I really kind of live in fear, even though I'm sure I would love it. I live in fear of them announcing a book telling this story because I feel like the moment they do that, they're telling us that they're not going back to this well.
Well, here's the thing.
I know that they're announcing the Kira rise, Crimson Reign, rise of Kira, but that's okay because that takes place before this movie.
Here's the thing. That book would have been the post-Solo tale unless they're still planning to do that story on screen, whether that's live action or animation, because there's this is what I learned about from the whole Siege of Mandalore thing. It's there was no reason for them to keep that story at bay for so long unless in the back of his mind Dave Filoni was like, I'm still going to do this one day. And then it happened. So like they're aware that they still want to tell that Kira Maul story, you know, on screen, because it hasn't been done in the comics. They haven't announced, you know, the forthcoming book is not going to be that. So like they're biding their time. We're going to get it.
One day, man. One day.
One day.
I feel like I've been very, very lucky in all the Star Wars projects that have been announced. It was like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we got a show about Ahsoka? Yes. Well, look at that. Wouldn't it be great if we got a show about Obi-Wan Kenobi? We got that. Wouldn't it be great if they did a movie starring Daisy Ridley as Rey Skywalker after The Rise of Skywalker? We're getting that. But the one thing that has not come through yet is this Kira Maul post-solo, you know.
Well, I felt like such a jerk inside, because when they first announced like this big slate of TV shows that was going to come out, and that wasn't this most recent con. I think it was either the one before or the one before that, where they, or God, how long has it been? I don't know. But whenever they laid out their like multi-year plan of shows they were doing, with everything being sort of a lot of things being interconnected and all that, I looked at a huge slate of shows, everything from, Andor, Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and, Ahsoka. I looked at all of that, and I think that's even when they announced, the Lando show was in production. I was like, I looked through that list, and it's a buffet of Star Wars goodness for fans. And I was like, where's the Kira Maul show? So this is like, it's one of the big things I want, because it's Darth Maul and it's Khaleesi. So yeah. But anyway, so we want that. But getting off that, like, but that is that just goes to show like what an amazing springboard this potentially was and still is. And I hope it gets, paid off, because like, we've seen what has sprung from Rogue One, where, a lot of things have sort of, not just Andor, which is, one of the greatest achievements that Star Wars has had, but also like even immediately after, we were seeing things, seeds planted in Rogue One that then, sort of flowered in even Rebels, which was happening at the same time. And, it seems like that we have to remember that before Rogue One, Saw Gerrera had just been in, season 5 of the Clone Wars. And now he feels like the linchpin of every single Star Wars thing. Like, is Saw Gerrera in the show? So that has just had such an amazing impact, and I really do wish for that with this. And I feel like it feels like we've been on the razor's edge of it so many times, because we got, like, in the finale of Clone Wars, we get, the mention of Crimson Dawn, and we get Dryden Voss's hologram. And it's like they've got the character model, they have to use it for something. And so, yeah, there's just, I do hope that somebody in Lucasfilm, whether that's Dave or, or whoever, like, they're just waiting for the right time to utilize so many of these elements on screen.
Yeah. And you can tell that there is a lot of love for this movie and these characters, within the Lucasfilm entity, because, they reference it constantly, and there is a lot of interconnectivity in all of Star Wars. But, this particular movie, which, could be, it, was a standalone movie in its own way, so many elements of it have made their way into other Star Wars stories, which always happens. But in this case, it really feels like it's because, there is a recognition that, this movie created a lot of, exciting new elements that people are going to want to play with and, expand on and learn more. And my hope is it will just be able to be, they will take that enthusiasm and manage to bring it back into, well, then let's tell a story about that rather than just, using those characters in other stories. But fortunately for this story, for this particular story, they take all those incredible pieces and they use them in such a way that they all feel like, well, most of them, I will say, most of them feel like they get their opportunity to shine. You mentioned Donald Glover as Lando. Funnily enough, we mentioned all the consternation about casting Alden Ehrenreich as Harrison Ford. No one seemed to have that concern about Donald Glover as Lando. Now, Donald Glover was a more well-known actor than Alden Ehrenreich. He is a phenomenally talented performer and writer, and he, definitely has that spirit that just makes him look like, oh yeah, he can play young Lando. But even within that, you mentioned that he does imitate some of Lando's mannerisms, but he also brings new elements to Lando that we had never considered before.
Yeah.
We learn new things about him. We get to see a different side of him that's not just the idea of him in popular culture as the smooth talking, very sensual kind of, player who might be a little bit underhanded in the way he approaches situations, but ultimately, like Han Solo, has a heart of gold in the right place and will do the right thing. Both in the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy, but like the thing is he gets there in the end, but he's on his own path, shall we say. But he was one of the elements that everyone seemed excited about at the before the movie came out, and he lives up to it. When he comes on screen, you just feel like the movie kicks into an even higher gear. And and they introduce him playing, Sabak, which was, there were certain things when this movie was announced that everyone knew we were going to see. We knew we were going to see the Kessel Run, and we knew we were going to see the famous moment where Han wins the Falcon from Lando, fair and square. But the way that they ended up telling that story was so good. It was so fun. It was so clever. And yeah, it showed that Lando, Lando's a little bit of a cheater, just a little bit, but doesn't mean we love him any less, right?
God, that moment when he knows that, he's missing the card, and it's like he keeps tapping it, which is so great. And Han's like, got everything you need there, buddy? It's so great. No, and I love their initial back and forth. So this is Sabak, and then.
Yeah. And then he turns it around, Han, which, I love that they made it essentially canonical in universe that no one knows how to pronounce anyone's name. So, so just roll with whatever works best for you.
And the fact that it's intentional on his part. He's like, and even all those years later, he's still digging it into Han. He says Han. Oh God, and and somebody else I mentioned Woody Harrelson in this movie as Beckett, Tobias Beckett, and he's like proto Han. He's like there's so many elements of a Han in that character, and and I do love that this movie, I'm not into we won't turn this into taking shots at George Lucas for the special edition, but I do love that this movie ends with Han shooting first. and reclaiming that for the character canonically.
Yeah.
But it also, like, in fairness to George, like, also then, if we accept, what happens in the special edition of A New Hope as, as canon, despite the fact that, some of us may have, access to the original versions of those movies.
Why would you ever want to watch that movie without McClunky? I don't understand.
Oh, Jesus. But if we accept the special edition as canon for, like, the the telling of the overall story, then that also does give Han sort of reason to, it's a character growth moment. but yeah, no, I like that they have that in. But then it's also a really tender moment between those two characters, because, like, even though, yes, he was going to shoot Han, but then once that the deed is done and Han takes him out, it allows them to sort of drop all that, and they share that final moment together, which is very endearing.
Yeah, I think Woody Harrelson is excellent in this movie. For the record, I am pro McClunky. I sounded anti McClunky before. I am pro McClunky. But when it comes to specifically the character of Tobias Beckett, he is not only the proto Han and the cautionary tale in many ways. He kind of shows us, like, what some people think of Han as a lot of times in the original trilogy, as the guy who's only out for himself, or he was, but when he first arrived, and we see that that's someone who Han could be if he had truly, taken the lesson that Tobias tries to teach him in such a way that he allowed it to change his perspective. Because they have another very important conversation on the Falcon where Beckett is trying to convince him that he shouldn't be looking forward to working with or having any kind of future with Kira, and he tells him that you know how I've survived so long. I trust no one. Assume everyone will betray you, and you will never be disappointed. That's where the shoot first mentality comes from. And Han, rightly points out that sounds like a lonely way to live, and Beckett tells him it's the only way. And the betrayals that Han suffers in this movie, both at the hands of Beckett and also by Kira, feel like they could have broken him and turned him into that type of character. He could have become the very thing that he destroyed and by killing Beckett, but he doesn't, because of Chewie, because of the good elements of his relationship with Kira, and ultimately because, as to bring it up again, as Kira says, you are the good guy. When Enfys is watching him on that hill, and he's talking with Beckett, and Enfys asks Kira what they're saying, and Kira just looks at them and is very confidently says, he's going to try to help you. Because that's what he is, and that's something that Beckett cannot break, even as he tries to teach Han in the ways of the galaxy, as it were. And it's all the more potent because we see in the beginning of the movie that Beckett is not a heartless character. He's not, I would even say, an evil character. He has a lot of actually charm and redeeming qualities, and those are actually very evident in the beginning of the movie in the relationship with his wife, Val, played by the wonderful Tandy Newton. And we can see that, this is a man who could have been better if the galaxy had allowed him to be, and if he had chosen to be that way. And ultimately, he chooses not to be that way because the tragic loss of his wife, Val, kind of causes him to double down on the perspective that you can't look out for anyone but yourself and allow yourself to care about anyone but yourself. And that's a lesson that Han, fortunately, chooses not to learn. As he says in the beginning of the movie, I don't think I'm ever going to learn. He was right not to learn on that one.
Yeah. It's one of the things that I do really like about Becca, though, how you mentioned he's not an evil character. It's what I find most fascinating about him, because for so much of this movie, and really the whole film, he is the mentor character. That's the role that he's filling, and the fact that they ultimately have him betray Han, and there's, and the end of the movie, has an antagonism between them. A different movie could have just made this character an all-out villain without any redeeming qualities, but I do feel like he's a fully three-dimensional, fleshed out character, and and it's just heartbreaking to see. It's a testament to this movie that they really do sell that relationship between him and Val in the short amount of time that we get with them, and so you feel his heartbreak as she sacrifices herself for him, which, and there's a whole other conversation to be had about, it's not the greatest thing in the world. I think the fact that we have, one black actress in the film and she gets killed off early, but it does make sense from a character standpoint. But at the same time, it's like, mixed feelings on that one.
It's probably the element of the movie that I feel like is the needed to be re-examined the most. However, I will, trying to set aside the larger unfortunate cultural implications, as you mentioned, of essentially fridging the one black actress and character in the cast. The character of Val, does serve a very specific story purpose, at much as all the characters in this movie serve the story of Han Solo, the titular character. And there's not necessarily something inherently wrong with structuring characters that way. But when you the benefits of casting an actress like Tandy Newton in this role is that she makes the character of Val feel so vibrant and so, interesting that you desperately want more from her. And when the story doesn't give it to her because of the way it was designed, you can't help but feel like something was taken from you, even if, that was something that the character was never designed for. So I do think it's somewhat unfortunate. But I try not to see it as, the movie committing some unforgivable sin. I feel like it's represents something of a missed opportunity and something that's a little bit unfortunate given our larger cultural discussion around films like this.
Yeah, I'd like to see more of her character as part of a backstory. Unfortunately, I feel like that's probably something that we end up getting in a novel, but I would certainly love it if they did something on screen, maybe it wouldn't have to be too far back in time, because then they'd end up casting different actors in those roles, but maybe a shortly before backstory for Beckett and for Val's character. It would be nice to get to explore not only their relationship but her as a character more, because I thought she was really interesting, and actually it's one of the things that the movie does really well, even though those characters are unfortunately short-lived, is that we do get the sense of this is a tight-knit crew, and hence the reason why we don't really expect them to be killed off so early, because not only do we have Val, but
Rio Durant, voiced by John Favreau.
Yeah, which is funny because you hear John Favreau's voice first, and then you picture John Favreau, and then he takes off the whole getup, and you see Rio, and it's like, that's not what I was expecting. But of course, you do get that early glimpse of his arms like pulling up his pants, which is great. But no, I love their whole dynamic, and and speaking of great characters, like right off the bat, Rio is a great character who, you know, and then in his dying moments, he's like, "You weren't kidding, kid. You are a great pilot," and there was just so much potential there for so many great, like, solidified friendships. I think among those characters, and the fact that we lose them, feels like a loss, and that's a great job writing those characters and the actors performing those characters. So yeah, it's on the one hand, I'm considering the sort of real world implications, but on the other hand, I'm like, but it's written really well, because those characters, you're supposed to really connect to them early on, so that the loss of them stings, and it sets other events into motion.
Yeah, I agree.
And then we get, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to pause right here because we're an hour in, so we'll go ahead and do the mid-roll. I want to thank the people who have tuned in. This was a last-minute stream, so I know we probably didn't get the word out that great, but yeah, thank you for tuning in. And next week we will be turning our attention over to the next 3 episodes of Ahsoka, which I can't wait for episode 5. Jared, it's we're so close, and I'm like, finally we're gonna, like, we got that little tease at the end of episode 4, and now we're gonna get live action Ahsoka and Anakin together, which I did not like. I've always said that, like, I don't like the way that animation is looked down upon. So for me, like, we've gotten Anakin and Ahsoka, and we've gotten their story, but it's also, what's really cool about this is just the fact that there's always felt, at least to me, like, because Anakin is performed somewhat differently in the animated series, even though they did a great job of tying together the different strands of story for, with Revenge of the Sith, when they did the finale of Clone Wars, it always has felt to me like I don't quite connect Hayden's Anakin to the storytelling of Clone Wars and Rebels and all that. There is something that when I watch those prequels, I'm like, yeah, they hadn't thought of Ahsoka yet. It's not part of the DNA of that story. So when we got to see Hayden and Rosario share the screen at the end of episode 4, it finally, to me, it was like, to use a Star Wars parlance, what was I about to say? The circle is now complete. It's like, that was like, there we go. Now I'm gonna feel it, and that'll only be strengthened, once we watch episode 5. But so I'm really excited about it. How are you feeling right now, as we're days away?
I have I have about as much anticipation for it as I have for any episode of a Star Wars television show ever. The only episodes I can think of that were that I had perhaps an equivalent level of hype for were fittingly the Siege of Mandalore in Clone Wars and the finale of Obi-Wan Kenobi. So if this episode can live up to those, then we will be we will be truly blessed, because this is this is something that I have been wanting to see forever. I really do feel like, tying Hayden Christensen's Anakin and all the love that he is rightly now receiving from the fans for his performance with the stories of the Clone Wars, where he is equally brilliantly portrayed by Matt Lanter, and having, like, reinforcing visually, the idea that those are in fact the same character. We just happen to see them in different mediums. I think is going to feel like so gratifying, and the prospect of the emotional catharsis that Ahsoka let's not forget her, this being her show, could potentially receive from getting to see her master again, given the traumatic events of his fall and the fact she hasn't really reckoned with them. If they manage
the fact that they
you know,
fought against each other too.
yeah, if they manage to do something where he manages to kind of essentially give her that closure, that's just going to feel incredible. So I hope that that's what we're in store for, as well as just some weird, trippy, crazy, off the wall, Force hype, like world between worlds.
I did not think we were going to. I mean, I knew it was like a possibility, but I did not actually truly think we were going to get like, world between worlds shenanigans in this. I knew it was potential, like maybe later on, because Palpatine was very much trying to access all this, and that like they weren't done with it. But if you had told me, like, even a couple months back, that the world between worlds will feature into live action, I would have been like, no, they're not going to do that. And the fact that it's being done so explicitly is like, Ahsoka, like, something's happened. Maybe did she die? And she's accessed, the world between worlds, and Anakin is there to like greet her, and like this is all so much more metaphysical than I would have thought we were going to get in this show. I was prepared for like maybe a traditional Force ghost Anakin, and flashback, which I still think we're gonna, and possibly through the world between worlds, maybe get glimpses of their past together through that way, maybe, because I'm still banking on Clone Wars era Anakin and Ahsoka in this, but we'll see. So I'm just so excited, and I'm bummed out that there is not a nearby theater that's showing those fan screenings. There is one in Orlando, but that would be quite a drive, and I do have to work on that day, which if there had been one like even an hour, hell, even if it was 2 hours away, I would have been calling into work. Like, I'm not gonna be able to make it. But like, yeah, it's not feasible. So I'm like, okay, I'll just be satisfied with watching it at home. But it's gonna be a big event, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, there is one of those screenings in San Francisco, relatively close to where I live. So I joined the wait list, but I'm not optimistic I'm ultimately going to get a ticket. So I'm looking forward to watching it at home, where I can, watch it as many times as I want, pause and dissect, every frame of footage to see, like, oh, is that Fives and Jesse behind Rex and Ahsoka? But so we'll see. But I'm also very, very glad that we're doing our stream about those episodes of Ahsoka next week after that episode, because I feel like if we'd done it this week, those 2 episodes we've gotten of Ahsoka are great, but I feel like we would have spent the entire 2 hours just geeking out about what we might see next episode. So let's get that on.
We'll still be doing geeking out about what we actually see.
which is always better. Always better to geek out about what you actually have, seen, rather than what you might see, because therein lies the way to madness. # speculate responsibly.
I do want to wrap this up so we can get back to our actual topic. But the one thing I will say is that, a full disclosure, I was definitely one of those people who was never terribly enthusiastic about Hayden's performance in the prequels. I don't think that's on him completely. I do think he was probably a bit inexperienced as an actor, but he got thrown into a situation where he was acting up against a lot of green screen. He's hardly the only actor in those movies that suffered as a result of that. And just because of, George Lucas is not famed for, his directorial skills of working with actors. But Hayden did a phenomenal job in Obi-Wan Kenobi. I think that, I don't think he was in need of quote unquote redemption, as I think a lot of fans probably ended up putting it, but it did offer him a chance as a more seasoned actor, and in a more probably artistically, enjoyable, scenario with the sets and the volume, which is much better than a green screen. Probably just afforded him a wonderful opportunity to really bring everything to Anakin. I think he did a great job, and yet at the end of episode 4 of this show, he didn't even like utter a word on screen. We heard his voice, but when he was actually on camera, he didn't even say a word. But just like the look on his face as he was looking at Ahsoka, he's absolutely phenomenal, and I cannot wait to see what he brings to episode 5. And I'm really glad he's gotten this opportunity, because after all the crap that a lot of people associated with prequels, but especially he had to sort of go through, it's nice to see that so many people are enthusiastic about having him back. And as someone who grew up with the prequels, I love the prequel renaissance that we're in. It's just so much fun.
Yeah, no, the joy that I feel from seeing actors like Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen, and above all Ahmed Best, start to get their due from the Star Wars fandom, it really can't be fully articulated. It just means so much to me. So, what may it continue?
Yes. And speaking of which, it's funny. I actually thought we were going to go somewhat in order with this stream, just because it feels like there's so many different acts of this movie. So I thought, well, first we'll discuss this act, then we'll go to no, we've just been all over the place, but that's fine. But on the topic of like the prequel era, we mentioned Maul, but let's talk about that moment at the end of this film, because for me, and that's what sucks about the fact that this movie is so, in my mind, underappreciated and flew under the radar when it came out, in that a lot of people didn't see it in theaters. The moment when Maul is revealed as the person that Kira is talking to, this was before Disney Plus, like I remember being so unprepared for any connective tissue between live action and animation, or live action and the larger universe at all, that when I saw Maul, even though I knew when this movie took place, my brain started going in a bunch of different directions, being like, wait, is this before the Phantom Menace? Even though I knew it wasn't, because it was inconceivable to me that this was the Maul from the animation era of like post Clone Wars and all that. It was only really when he said, come to me on Dathomir. Yes. I was like, holy shit, they're doing it.
Yeah.
It's like they actually mean it when they say that it's a larger universe. and it was just such a mind-blowing. Now it's like, yeah, of course. Everything's connected. We got Ahsoka in live action, all that stuff. We've had Cad Bane, it's but at this point in time, it was just so unbelievable and unexpected. I'm positive I jumped out of my seat when it happened.
Yeah, it is one of my favorite memories, not only of watching this film, but among my Star Wars experiences in the theater, when Kira starts that hologram and starts speaking to this infamous, Crimson Dawn, hidden in the shadows leader that we've heard about for the entire movie, and then he takes his hood off and it's Maul. I was so thrilled. And part of the reason I was so thrilled, not just to have Maul back on my screen again, but also for it to be so consistent with what we knew about his character at this point in the timeline. Because, he's not like, even though Maul originated in the films, he really did come into his own as the, like, in the animated series after his, resurrection slash, post Spider Legs recovery, Witches of Dathomir magic.
Which is so funny. I will say that I always do my best not to mention that part when I talk about, to people who don't realize that Maul was resurrected in the Clone Wars and that he has this whole other stories. I usually omit the Spider Legs part because even though it works in the context when you watch it, if you say it to someone, they're going to be like, what the hell?
Yeah, it
sounds terrible.
It was a phase, it was, everyone goes through, when you're resurrected, you go through your Spider Legs phase. But the fact is that, Maul really, he blossomed during the Clone Wars and became a much more fascinating character. And it just, what part of the brilliance of this reveal is not just like, oh my God, it's Maul back again, and he's played by, Ray Park and voiced by Sam Witwer, so it's this perfect fusion of the two, characters. It's the fact that it makes so much sense. I think back to, when Rogue One was being written, they were, they had a role written in the script for this old revolutionary who was a mentor for Jyn Erso, and the character didn't really have a name, and then people looked at it and you're like, who would be perfect for that? Saw Gerrera from the Clone Wars. And so he was the first character who made that jump from animation. And again, even though Maul originated in the films, he kind of had a similar track here where when the script was initially being written by Lawrence Kasdan, he had written in the character of this kind of unseen, nebulous Crimson Dawn boss above Dryden Voss. But they didn't necessarily know who that character would be. And so they were thinking of candidates, and it was actually John Kasdan, Lawrence's son, who was, very familiar with all the intricacies of the lore and inserts a lot of references to that in the movie. But he was like, who actually makes perfect sense for this, because he is he has become a criminal overlord during this time frame, Darth Maul. And the fact that they were like, great, let's do it. Don't worry about the fact that for most people they thought Obi-Wan cut him in half in the Phantom Menace and that was the end of him. We're just gonna we're gonna do it because this is the story, and he is Maul was alive during this time period. This is what he's up to. Makes perfect sense that he would be the man in the shadows pulling the strings, and they went with it, and they got a moment of pure magic out of it.
Yeah, it's almost, and I think that's one of the things that broke my heart the most, the fact that the movie underperformed. I was like, no, this should be huge. This should be like a launching off point for so much interconnectivity. And we didn't have, the Disney Plus shows weren't on the horizon at that point. So to my mind, I was like, the fact that this movie didn't do good was going to torpedo potential for further interconnectedness. Little did I know. But I was just so excited about that, and you briefly mentioned the fact that Sam Witwer returned to voice the character from the animated shows. And that for me was just as big as the fact that they made reference to Dathomir and the fact that this was the character who had all the experiences of Clone Wars. The fact that the guy who had really propelled Maul through his voice work on Clone Wars was actually getting to voice him in live action. I was like, yes, this is now Star Wars can really take off in new and adventurous directions. And I'm really so even though so many things from this film have not necessarily seen fruition yet, I feel like this part of the legacy of this movie has done wonderful. The fact that we now have so many things that we never imagined we were going to get in live action, and I think, and again, I talked about, I hate the way that people look down on animation because one of the favorite refrains among the snarky is, oh, Dave Filoni's just bringing in his animated characters. And it's like, no, they're characters. They're part of the Star Wars universe. It makes sense to bring these characters into these stories. And that's exactly the case with Maul here. He did make perfect sense. This was a character who had assembled his own criminal empire. So like it was just perfection that they went in and used him this way. And it's the opposite of what I would have expected. I would have expected some anonymous shadowy guy, and and then in retrospect some of us could have been like, what they should have done, they should have used Darth Maul there. That would have been awesome. And the fact that they actually did it is just amazing. So like I'm always nervous about like overemphasizing the importance of like the ending here and the way he's utilized, because it is a smaller part of the film. But I can't like overstate the impact it had when I was sitting there watching this.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. It's not just something that's thrown in there because, like we said, it makes sense for the character, but also there's seeds planted all throughout the movie. Then in retrospect, you're like, well, of course it's Maul. But the fact that, I didn't see it coming,
Yeah.
But it really just makes sense with the seeds that are planted. And especially when you've seen the entire story, and yeah. So.
Yeah. And the fact is, in retrospect, the name of the criminal organization being Crimson Dawn, makes sense. But what I really wanted to say was another reason that Maul is such a perfect choice for that scene. It's not just because he fits and he makes sense and you needed to have, the hidden criminal overlord in the shadows. It's the power that he brings to that role. Because you can tell that as a former Sith Lord, Maul, he might be choosing to operate in the shadows, but he has true agency in the galaxy. And the fact that, we see Dryden Voss, Dryden proves throughout this movie that he is, more than capable. But he serves Maul. He lives in fear of Maul. And when Kira, opens up that hologram and speaks to Maul, you can tell that Kira, this incredibly strong-willed, resourceful character, is terrified. And in retrospect, it makes the fact that she chooses to go and serve him and work for them, and it's tragic because it's her reinforcing her own perspective that everybody serves somebody. But it also kind of makes sense that she was like that she would think, in a sense, how could I ever break free of someone like this? And also, like, if Han has the opportunity to try and escape from this man, he should, because knowing Han Solo, he would be more than willing to try and take on Darth Maul, and that would not go well for him at all.
Yeah.
So Kira essentially, she makes a very cold and calculating but choice to leave Han behind and go and serve as Maul's top lieutenant, but she's also trying to save Han from this fate. And in that, it's almost an act of compassion in a strange way.
Yeah, and it's her choice it's so multi-layered, because on the one hand, like, it is a power play, you know, because that is part of who she is, but it's also saving Han, and not just in the sense that Han might have, you know, of his own volition, tried to maybe, you know, say we'll go up against him together, but the fact that it misdirects Maul's attention away from looking for anybody else's involvement. If she has a story to tell him of what happened, then that's the end of it. So it's that, but it's also her own, like, you know, she doesn't want to be, you know, at the bottom again. That's, you especially see a lot of this if you read that prequel novel to Solo. I'm trying to remember what it was called.
Most Wanted.
Most Wanted, yeah. It's like she wants out of that. She wants, you know, she wants to ascend the ladder, you know, to reference that other show. Chaos is a ladder. Yeah. So then that's why, like, she's such a fascinating character that I want to see more of.
Yeah.
Because which side of that was, you know, it was definitely both, but, you know, you'd love to, you know, I'm not sure if, I'm sure there's probably something about it in the novelization, which I haven't read, but I'd love to know her thought process, you know, as she's doing that. Which, by the way, I just mentioned the novelization. I do have it right here. I just haven't read it. We'll get to that someday.
I have it too. It's buried in one of these boxes. But yeah, Qi'ra, you know, the fact that she makes this choice in this moment is such an incredibly, you know, interesting choice for her character. God, I love that shot. That shot is
so beautiful.
So good.
Like, this is a gorgeous film.
Yes. No, we should shout out the cinematographer, Bradford Young, deserves all the acclaim because this might be the best shot Star Wars film, to be honest. But what I was going to say about Qi'ra is, you know, when we first heard about the existence of this character before the movie came out, and we knew she would be played by Emilia Clarke, and we knew she would be kind of a love interest for Han, you know, we can immediately start to think about, like, putting her character into archetypes. Is she going to be a tragic character? I was very worried before the movie's like, oh, well, clearly since Han ends up with Leia and she isn't referenced in the original trilogy, well, then she must die in some tragic fashion, aka what everyone thought was going to happen.
Hold your thought, because I have something to say about that, which is, I remember when I was watching this in the theater, and I was reminded of it today, which is the part where, and we haven't even talked about the Kessel Run, and a lot of other stuff. We're doing. This stream might go a bit long. It's like when they're escaping, and which, by the way, that whole sequence is a love letter to classic Star Wars and John Williams, especially. But it is when Han says, I could use a co-pilot, and she sits down in the seat and Chewie is behind her. In that moment, I remember thinking, oh no, she's going to die. Because, like, this is why in the future movies, you know, Qi'ra is not like his co-pilot of the Falcon. But then, of course, 5 minutes later, it's actually because she doesn't know what she's doing behind the wheel of the Falcon. And when, you know, Han says, we need to do the da-da-da-da, and she's like, yeah, we definitely do. It was such a great comedic moment. And then you know, Chewie reveals that, you know, he knows how to do that. And there's the joke about how, you know, he's, you know, what, 180 years old. And Han's like, you look great. And she's like, Chewie, get in. And that's how that relationship is really born with the two of them piloting. But yeah, no, it's so yeah, I was very much in fear that she was going to die in the film, which, you know, that would have two reasons why that wouldn't have been great, because it's sort of that stereotypical, you know, storyline. You want to see something better for for women characters in in modern day films, but also because it's Emilia Clarke, and I wanted her to go on and be in more movies, which I still do. And so I'm so glad that not only did she not die, but there was something much more complex in store for her character.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea that like once it seemed like she might make it through the end of the movie, which ultimately she does and goes on to bigger things. The other archetype that I was wondering about her was she going to fulfill the role of effectively the femme fatale? Like, is she going to turn evil and betray Han? And that's why she ultimately doesn't carry forward, and he ends up going on and finding the love of his life with Princess Leia. What's great about it is they do play with those ideas. She is a tragic character. She does have an element of the femme fatale in her, out of the a survivalist instinct. She does betray Han, or appears to do so, but ultimately her reasonings behind all that are so much more complex and layered and well motivated, that it just makes everything feel like she is her own kind of character within the Star Wars galaxy, one who does have tremendous agency, and that's why she has so much storytelling potential going forward. The prospect of her, it was already fascinating that she managed to rise from Corellian scrum rat to top lieutenant in one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the galaxy, but she's not done climbing. Eventually she takes over Crimson Dawn herself, and you can see that like it really kind of emphasizes the fact that she is a character who is like she is not an archetype. She is her own character, and everything that Emilia Clarke brings to her, that performance, makes her so, and elevates her into honestly one of the best characters in all of Star Wars.
I'm going to take a moment just to like highlight, especially as it relates to Kira's character, her costume design and like her makeup and stuff, it was just utterly fantastic in the film. They did a great job, and she has a lot of like different outfits that later in the film, like when they go to get Lando, she's got the whole fur thing going on, and I love her when they make the entrance into what's my mind's blanking out.
This is on Kessel.
Kessel, yeah. I should have known that right off the bat. Yeah, the fact that she gets out like one of Lando's capes, which is great. Which again, earlier I mentioned the closet scene. It's so funny. You got to look at all of Lando's capes and clothes, and which is great. They did such a great job with so much of this movie. But yeah, the costume designs, and and we mentioned the cinematography. They did a great job with so many different elements of this movie.
Yeah, I feel like that's almost a perfect segue into talking about the Kessel Run, and the fact that this is one of the big centerpieces of the movie, along with the possibly equally awesome train heist sequence on Vandor, which I just love dearly. But the Kessel Run was the thing that when we heard about there was going to be a young Han Solo movie, like we just knew it had to be there. And that with that knowledge comes expectation of, well, how are they going to pull it off? And how are they going to do it in a creative and interesting way that will satisfy over 40 years of fan speculation about what is the Kessel Run and how do you do it in less than 12 parsecs, when parsecs are clearly a unit of distance and not time, and aka all those conversations that every nerd has been having forever. And they did have a kind of a blueprint for it, because there had been references to the Kessel Run in the Legends novels, so specifically I think the Jedi Academy trilogy had mentioned that, like, oh, it involves like some black holes that you have to go around, and you have to be going at a certain speed so you don't get drawn in. But the way that they ultimately realize this sequence is just, it's so clever, it's so, engaging, and it's just plain fun. There are a few moments in the Star Wars theatrical experience that have given me like a bigger rush of just hell yes kind of joy than when the moment you alluded to earlier, Kira surrenders the co-pilot seat to Chewbacca, and Chewbacca sits down, and the main theme kicks in because they give each other an excited look, and they just go.
But one of my favorite moments, though, it comes before that, when they're still on Kessel, and it's when they're escaping. And one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the character of L3, which we're going to circle back in a little bit and give her due, because she is just phenomenal. But it's when L3 has been shot, and so Lando is sort of preoccupied with her, and so Beckett says, Han, and Han says, I'm on it. And then he runs, gets in the pilot seat, and the second he gets in the seat and starts like flipping switches, that's when you start to get the John Williams, and it's like that, and that's when like my smile just got even bigger. I was like, oh, here we go. And the love letter that the entire sequence just, it gives to John Williams, like from this, like that theme to the Star Destroyer theme when that shows up, to the asteroid theme from Empire. There's just so much in this whole sequence. I mean, he really pays tribute to John Williams throughout the entire score, but this sequence, more than anywhere else, is just like this is an example of when I hate it when composers like will take the reins from like of the music and like be like, I have to do something that's completely just my own and discard everything else. It's like, no, like they knew that they really had to pay tribute to John Williams, and in this movie and this sequence more than ever just does it so beautifully.
I find it to be a complete triumph, the fact that they managed to create a sequence that, again, had been speculated about for over 40 years, and they delivered something that I found probably better than what my imagination could have come up with. And that we could go over all the individual beats that make it so special. But it just, like from the moment it starts till the absolutely perfect punctuation note at the end, I feel like I just felt like I went on an incredible ride. I felt like I'd done the Kessel Run with them, and that just sense of triumph at the end that ends up, it's a moment that will live in legend within Star Wars, in addition to our own interactions with it. And it was such an iconic moment that you always kind of felt like, given the nature of Han as a character, it's like, well, he's got to be BSing at least a little bit about it, right? But the thing is, he wasn't. He was that awesome, and he did manage to do everything. And the way that they managed to kind of take the piss out of him a little bit at the end is just perfect, where he's like, I just did the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs, and Chewie's like, well, he's probably saying like, well, it's probably more like 12.5, and he looks at it, he's like, nah, if you round down, buddy.
God, it's so great. And there were so many like little beats throughout that sequence that I love. I love when, I don't remember exactly the things that Beckett said but it's like, Han's like, are the TIE fighter still trailing us or something? And Beckett made some like analogies, and Han's like, I don't know what that means. And then Beckett says something else, and he's like, are they close or not? It's
Yeah,
like, yes, they're right on.
The specific analogies are like Rashnald on a Kylak and like a Gingerson's pelt, and I don't know what those mean either. So.
Oh God, that was great because it's like those wonderful comedic touches that that you love when you're in the middle of a thrill ride. That just like the best feeling in the cinema is when you are incredibly excited and then you just burst out laughing at the same time. It's so wonderful, and I remember how I felt watching that sequence in theaters. It was just so amazing. And then when they take the drop of coaxium, and then first the engine craps out and then you get Lando going, oh shit. And then it hits off and the ship goes.
Yeah. Which at the time you're like, oh well, you know what he's trying to say, but perhaps he was going to say some Star Wars equivalent, and then Andor just confirmed that no, the word shit does exist in the Star Wars galaxy, and that's exactly what he was going to say.
So let's backtrack a little bit now and talk about L3 because it's criminal that we haven't mentioned.
Oh, there are a few characters that is criminal we haven't talked about. Well,
yeah.
Please let's talk about L3.
Yeah. The Phoebe Waller-Bridge, just amazing. For anybody who didn't know this already, between I want to see her in lots of Lucasfilm stuff because we've gotten her here, we've gotten her in Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny. She is a treasure, and I love her in this, and the fact that she's a very she's an activist droid, and and it's so great, and and I love Lando's like, what did you do, L3? She's like, I staged a revolution. So great. And I love when she's cutting the fence and she's like, don't look at me, I can't perform when you're watching me. and then she's like, I can feel you watching.
You think you would have thought by the time we got around to Solo: A Star Wars Story that we had seen almost every type of droid that you could see in the galaxy, but L3 is like the Millennium Falcon, like Han Solo, like Lando Calrissian. She is truly one of a kind. Yeah. And I really, the fact that Phoebe Waller-Bridge portrayed her via performance capture, which is part of what allowed them to give her those kind of certain little human touches, almost as it were, where that as great and as awesome as it is to see them do things through like practical puppeteering, when you can have an actual performer doing those movements for a character like this, it makes her feel that much more dynamic and that much more alive. And everything that L3 is saying throughout the movie about the fact that droids are sentient, that they should have equal rights within the galaxy, it feels more appropriate because she herself is such a firebrand that you're like, yeah, she's absolutely right, and it makes it all the more tragic given that the end that she meets. And I don't really know if ultimately what happens to her was the right thing for her, but she leaves an incredible impression on in just the relatively short amount of time that she's in the movie.
Yeah, and it's like I don't know how I feel about the fact that her fate ultimately is that she becomes part of the Falcon in that way. But at the same time, it's like it's really cool then to think that that throughout the original movies, like that L3 is a key part of the ship.
Yeah. And no, go ahead. No, and I was just going to say that it feels in that story beat feels very much directly tied to the scene in The Empire Strikes Back when C-3PO is communicating with one of the Falcon's computers. He's like, "Sir, I don't know where your ship learned to speak, but it has the most peculiar dialect." And they probably thought that, that's a fun way to explain that, because L3 does have such an incredible personality here. It does, given the fact that her entire character is about her, agency and the idea of droid rights, it does make it a little bit uncomfortable given, when the droid, she dies, although we know that droids can be rebuilt and resurrected. The fact that she's uploaded, her consciousness is uploaded into the Falcon's computer, but, she still ends up helping to save the day for the heroes. And, given the closeness of her relationship with Lando, is that something she would have wanted, knowing how that she was, effectively dying? It's not something we'll know. And I would love to know the answer. In the novelization of the Rise of Skywalker by Ray Carson, who actually wrote the Most Wanted book, that's the Solo prequel. There's actually a wonderful little moment where Lando comes aboard the Falcon, and he kind of is familiarizing himself with it again, and he actually goes over to the computer and is like, "Hey girl, hey L3," and it's a beautiful little grace note that I love, and I'm glad that they reflected on that. It does make me wonder why Lando was willing to gamble with her at the end if he was that attached to her, but that's kind of the complicated nature of that.
I do feel like there's sort of they put out those books that have the around the corner short stories for each of the original movies. I almost feel like there's some little short stories we can get between Lando and L3, as she's part of the ship, ironing out these issues of does she want to remain that way, the fact that the ship is going to Han and stuff like that. I feel like there are stories we could get in that way that would sort of iron out some of that stuff for me, because I would
And Star Wars has a time-honored tradition of doing exactly that, taking the issues that people have with the movies and somebody like, you know what, I've got an idea for a book about that.
Yeah. Oh, God. But yeah, no, she is great. And I love when Kira, takes out, the oh God, what's that? My mind's going blank today. What's
the pike.
The pike. Yeah, when she takes out the pike, and L3 just sort of stands back and goes, "Whoa!" Just her reactions are so great. And when she's taking off the control, off of the droid, and she's like, so barbaric. And everything with that character was so great. And I love the first time we see her when she's getting in a fight with the organizer of the place. That's of course Ron Howard's brother, Clint Howard, who is always in Ron Howard films, which, by the way, I know we talked a little bit about the way the film was assembled at the beginning, but it's, Ron Howard is the director of this film, and so much about this movie does feel like it's in touch with sort of the fabric of classic Star Wars in a way that I think that a lot of the other films aren't. And that's because he's part of that generation, It feels very much of a spirit with, what George Lucas was going for with the original movies. And so I don't know what this movie would have been, prior to his involvement. But I can safely say that I'm happy it worked out the way that it did, because we got him directing, to my mind, one of the best Star Wars movies ever. And then we got Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, in the same year, doing Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and I think that worked out pretty well for them and for us.
Yeah, I sometimes these things, you know, they happen for a reason. Shall we say? And the whispers that I had heard was that Phil Lord and Chris Miller's take on the movie was more comedic, more improvisational. They were making bigger deviations from Lawrence Kasdan's script, which he was not happy with. And ultimately, you know, someone in the Lucasfilm command structure, likely Kathleen Kennedy, looked at it and was like, "This isn't working for what we think it needs to be." And they went out and got Ron Howard, who does have that connection to George Lucas, both from the fact he was in American Graffiti, and Lucas was really a big mentor to him on Willow in 1987. He was one of the candidates to originally direct Phantom Menace. So the fact that he finally got his chance to do a Star Wars movie and crushed it in this, you know, respect feels so gratifying. And his the Howard legacy continues in Star Wars, because now his daughter Bryce Dallas Howard has proven that she's got those directing chops as well during her episodes of The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. So you know, it's a very, you know, rewarding and reassuring aspect of that.
There's something else about Ron Howard doing this and thinking about the movie Willow. Obviously, the effects at that time were much more primitive, but like we get those, you know, creatures at the end of Willow, you know, and there's a lot of creature effects and stuff throughout that film. And then what we get with Lady Proxima in the beginning of this, even though she's CGI, but feels very much of that era of like creature effects that you could almost imagine her being done as a stop motion creature in the old days. And actually she reminded me of those kinds of creature effects, almost something from Willow, or from like, you know, there's this creepy creature from the director's cut of Legend that kind of, you know, evokes, you know, a similar style. And so I loved that. And so I absolutely love what he did with this film. And so I wouldn't have had it any other way. I do think that even though it's nice to be able to sort of branch out with different styles, I think that we've seen that a bit, especially with Andor, which is a very different style to traditional Star Wars. But you do still have to adhere to what people expect a Star Wars, you know, a Star Wars film or television series to be. There are ways that you can branch out, and then there's ways that maybe just don't feel quite right. And my suspicion is that maybe Phil Lord and Christopher Miller just went a little bit too far outside the box, which, you know, and I don't think that's necessarily completely their fault, because that was kind of the mission statement of like what they were going to try and do. Like Rogue One was supposed to be like the really hard-edged, you know, political thriller / heist, you know, movie. And this, I remember when it was pitched, because those guys were involved, it was going to be something with more of a comedic edge. And I think they just discovered as they were going through that, you know, at the end of the day, you still need Star Wars to feel like Star Wars. And like I said, I think it all worked out for the best, because it would be heartbreaking if we hadn't gotten the Spider-Verse films, which, by the way, that was another candidate for today that I was going to pitch you, was Across the Spider-Verse, but then I realized that no, maybe we should just start with the first one on that one. And we'll set aside a different time for that, because those are brilliant films. And so sometimes just things work out the way they're supposed to. And I'm glad we got the movie we did.
Yeah, I'm firmly in favor of, you know, there's always going to be appeal for people with the road not taken with these kinds of things, like, and speculating, would that have been better? Would the grass have been greener on the other side? I really don't often subscribe to that, especially when you get a look at what could have been, and you realize that, Oh God, that was they did not do that for a reason. See Colin Trevorrow's hideously awful script for episode 9. But in particular, I feel like this movie just feels true to the spirit of Han Solo as a character, and the fact that it took a very long and winding path to get there is unfortunate because it probably damaged the movie's commercial prospect. But creatively, I love where we ended up, and I would not have taken in the other road. I'm happy we have the film that we did.
Let's definitely take some time to discuss some of the things that we just didn't get around to. I don't think we talked very much about Dryden Voss's character, played by the amazing Paul Bettany, who I never cease to be incredibly, as if I had something to do with his career, but I'm very proud of Mr. Bettany, because I just remember the first time I saw him walk onto screen, which is hilarious because of the fact that he always says that his ass made its entrance into Hollywood before he did, which was in A Knight's Tale.
Yeah.
Which he was just absolutely delightful in, and it's long been one of my favorite performances. And just to see his career over the years has been wonderful, and to see him have so much commercial success. I know I've always kind of thumbed my nose a little bit at the MCU movies, but he is remarkable as Vision in that, and I love seeing him here as Dryden Voss, like another character that, even though he meets his demise at the end of this film, there's still lots of stuff I would love to see with him. We got teased a little bit with his hologram appearance in the end of Clone Wars. I know they've got something planned for him in animation, because they don't just create character models for a tiny little hologram and then discard it. Like they've got plans for, like, I'm ready for an animated series that like focuses on Darth Maul and his criminal empire, and I feel like that's where we're going to see him. But I digress. In this movie, he's just amazing, and I love the touch of like his scars get like bigger and more inflamed, like the angrier he gets, which is such a cool idea. And I love how like he turns from like utterly menacing to like polite, and and disarming. He's like, in one moment he's like, here's what I need you to do. I need you to give me a reason not to kill you. And then and then once they've sorted everything out, he's like, well, this is great. I feel good about this. We should do it again sometime.
He just has, like, Paul Bettany is such a charming actor, and it's rare that we see him use that power for evil as he does in this movie, but it's he does it brilliantly. It's a wonderful villain performance, and it's all the more impressive in yet another story of the movie having to make moves behind the scenes. He was not originally cast in this role. It was originally going to be the late great Michael K. Williams, who famously played Omar Little on The Wire, who was going to be the Dryden Voss character, and it would have been kind of a different take on the character because Michael K. Williams is very famous for playing very intense characters, very dangerous characters, but also having that same charm. But it would have been a very different role, especially because it was rumored, I believe, that if in Michael K. Williams' version of the character, the Dryden Voss may have been an alien. But by the time that Michael K. Williams had to drop out and they needed a new actor to fill the role, they ended up getting Paul Bettany to play, I don't know if he's human or if he's a near human, character, but regardless, he's Paul Bettany on the screen. But he makes you believe that he is Dryden Voss, dangerous criminal syndicate, someone who could believably be the face of one of the most dangerous criminal empires in the galaxy, while its true leader Maul is hiding in the shadows because he doesn't want Palpatine to slap him down. But he, he's menacing. He has a kind of oily charm to him that almost makes you like him, but also there's that element of that he really is, unless you forget he's a despicable character. The way that he kind of handles and speaks to Kira throughout the movie really makes it clear that he is the one who is keeping her in the cage. It's coded very much as like an abusive, kind of kept woman dynamic with her. And she makes allusions to the things that she's had to do to rise in this place. You can imagine that Dryden probably was the one who made her do some of those things. And you can see that even though Kira puts on a smile throughout the movie, there are moments like after Dryden's Sentinel on the mission where Kira just looks back at him and you can tell that she's just seething with all this suppressed rage at this man who is like effectively holding her leash. But that makes it all the more cathartic when she's the one who gets to kill him, and she's the one who makes it, who tricks him in the end. And
just that switch, and she's like, it's what I was taught: find your opponent's weakness and exploit it. And today, and then she turns around, I'm yours. And which, by the way, I did have to get. It's not a very high quality one, but it's a GIF of their fight, which is just awesome.
Yeah.
I love the way that's framed, and that's our de facto lightsaber fight sequence where we don't actually get one in this film because there's not Jedi, but yeah, it's. That was great. I love all that. As despicable as it is, I love their dynamic, just, the way he's very dismissive of her, but at the same time, like, clearly, feels like he commands her obedience, where, he'll be like, my subordinate said, no, it's too soon for Kira. She won't be able to pull this off, which I personally think was all BS. Nobody said that to him. He was just saying in that moment because he already knows she's going to betray him. And,
right.
But then by the same token, he's like, you don't understand, Han. She's done things you could never understand, but I do. Oh God, it's very sickening, but just beautiful work by Bettany. He's normally really so good at playing very nice guy, but here he's a dirtbag, but he's a very well portrayed dirtbag.
Indeed. So satisfying when he gets his comeuppance in the end. But,
yeah. So
all right, I feel like I need to make an intervention here because I feel personally guilty that we have spent 2 hours on this stream and we have not talked about the awesomeness that is arguably my favorite character in this entire movie, Enfys Nest. Can we please talk about
Yes. Okay, in my defense, like, because she does, like, she's in throughout the entire movie, but her unmasking doesn't come until the end. So I feel like I was kind of belaboring that. But yeah, no. This is like, I talked about untapped potential, and even though I think she's another character who has popped up in the comics, and Lucasfilm and Disney overall have obviously been utilizing the actress who plays her, but this character needs to come back into Star Wars. And what's her name again?
Yeah,
Erin. Yeah,
Erin Kellyman. Yeah.
Erin Kellyman. She is absolutely phenomenal, and I had to make sure that I looked up some pictures of the actor, so I didn't just get Enfys Nest with her helmet on, because yeah, she is just absolutely amazing in this. And behind her in this picture, you can see Warwick Davis, which is
Yes.
not the only time they appeared on screen together, because they were together in the Disney Plus series Willow, even if Disney wants us to forget about that.
Oh God, don't remind me.
Yeah.
Yeah, Warwick Davis reprising his character as Weasel from The Phantom Menace. In
Yeah.
fact. But yeah, Erin Kellyman as Enfys Nest was perhaps the biggest surprise of the entire movie for me, and that surprise and what she brings to the character and just the complexity of this character honestly was enough to shoot it to another level for me. I was already loving the movie. Enfys took it up another level, and part of the reason for that is, when we saw her in the promotional material and, before the movie, obviously she was wearing her mask, but we didn't even know it was a she. They were keeping this character very under wraps, and all we knew was that this character of Enfys was the leader of this gang called the Cloud Riders, which were, they were riding on, they are essentially like a gang of outlaws, of marauders, as Tobias Beckes calls them, and we figured, they would serve their purpose as, an antagonist for Han Solo, perhaps not the main antagonist, but an adversary for Han, and they perform that role brilliantly during the train sequence on Vandor, where we see just how incredibly capable and dangerous Enfys is as a fighter. But at that moment, we're assuming that they're after the coaxium for the exact same reason that our ostensible heroes are, which is, they want the money. And that just makes the moment at the near the end on Savareen, when Enfys takes off her mask and reveals that she's actually, a young woman. I don't know exactly how old she's supposed to be. It looks like she's meant to be like either late teens, early 20s, but someone who has clearly been through a hellish amount in her very short life already. Someone who was born into the fight, much as, Cassian Andor finds himself, a bit later in the timeline. And what I absolutely loved about it was the fact that we learn that this character is in fact a proto member of what we will come to know as the Rebel Alliance. The fact that we were calling this character a pirate, a marauder, someone who's ruthless, someone we think is selfish, like out for themselves. And then when she tells that story about the locals of Savareen who were oppressed and brutalized by Crimson Dawn, something that's happening all over the galaxy, and the fact that they are among a group of people who have chosen to stand up to this evil and oppression and fight back. And she has that moment where at the end where she says, "We're not marauders, we're allies, and the war has just begun." And she gives that little smile. And I just vividly remember a chill going down my spine when that happened, because I just thought that was such a cool idea. Bringing the rebellion into the movie in this way, when it's not the Rebel Alliance yet. We see throughout the process of Rebels and the other shows that, like, it started as a factions of, scattered different cells that are fighting the Empire's oppression in their own ways all across the galaxy. And she is the leader of one of those cells, effectively. But this was one of the first times we'd really seen that idea in practice, outside of maybe like the partisans in Rogue One. But at that point, though, that's so close to A New Hope that clearly the Rebel Alliance, what we know as the Rebel Alliance, had to be established at this point. This is much earlier in the timeline, and we have the chance to see that this is someone who ended up making the choice, as she says, as her mother would have if she was still alive and wore the mask, to stand up and fight back. And she doesn't have any, you know, special powers other than looking awesome as hell. I actually have my little my Emphas Nest figurine here. I don't really collect a lot of action figures, but I had to have this one and her awesome bike. But just the way that it plays into the end of the movie, and ultimately, as I mentioned, how every character serves Han's stories, how she serves as a mirror for Han and like what he could be, because he's not ready to, as quote unquote, join the cause at this moment. But the moment that she reveals what her true mission is, he wants to help her, as Kira says, and he like, it's never a question for him that this is the right side to be on, not with Dryden Voss and the Crimson Dawn criminal syndicate. And that just makes the moment at the end where he comes up to her after having defeated Beckett and Voss and bringing the coaxium to them. And they have what might be my favorite scene in the entire movie, where he gives them the coaxium and she says, you know what that really is? And he's like, about 60 million credits worth of refined coaxium. She said, no, it's the blood that brings life to something new. And he's like, what's that? And she says, a rebellion. And I got chills from that, but they just redoubled when the conversation continues. And she says, you could come with us, you know, we need warriors and leaders like you. And he thinks about it for a second, then looks at you. He's like, nah, not really. Yeah. And then she smiles and she's like, maybe someday you'll feel different. And of course he plays it off with the classic, don't hold your breath, kid.
Which is pure
which is pure Han, the Han that we know from the original trilogy. But it's just such powerful connection that given what we know where Han's journey ultimately goes and where it ends, like the line between, maybe someday you'll feel differently, and the moment when Han chooses to turn around and bring the Falcon back to save Luke from the Death Star, it shines like a bright gold light for me, and I think it's so cool, and it's all because of the character of Emphas Nest, who is just awesome. And as you said, needs to come back to Star Wars ASAP.
Yeah, and you mentioned in Rogue One we see that partisans, which I also want to mention, you can see two tubes right here in this picture with her, and there's a scene in the novelization with where Saw Gerrera shows up with little Jyn Erso as well. And so like there's so much like storytelling there that I would love to see. And so, and the fact that it's been a few years, so it's not like, if you're gonna do like an origin story here, like I think animation would probably be a good way to do that. But regardless, there's like so much here that I would love to see, but I really want to see her come back into play, maybe a few years down the line. And speaking of animation, I'd love to see if she interacts with the Bad Batch. I think the fact that we're going into the final season has me to where I'm not holding my breath on that one, but that would still be cool, because I like the idea of seeing more of these early stage rebel factions like interacting and sort of being aware of each other.
Yeah, the Bad Batch feels like the kind of place where Enfys would show up, or maybe at that point in the timeline it's her mother and Enfys hasn't assumed the mantle yet. But either way, I just want this character to continue on in some form or fashion, because this is a case of just lightning potential, like caught in a bottle. Whatever Erin Kellerman, I had no idea who she was before this movie.
And now it's always exciting whenever she shows up in something.
Yeah, and now she was in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. She was as Carly Morgenthau. She was in Willow as Jade Claymore, and she
had a small appearance in The Green Knight as well.
Yes, she does. Fantastic. So she's one of those actresses who feels like she's carving out a little niche for herself in these like beloved fantasy properties, and will just be like a constant going forward, and with good reason, because she is awesome. What she does with this character in such a short frame of time is like truly special, given the fact that like again, nobody knew who she was before this movie, and she wasn't in the marketing at all, other than as the masked form of her character. And she walks in at almost the hour and 45-minute mark, takes her helmet off, and in my opinion, almost steals the entire show.
Yeah, no, it's really amazing the way they set up the character, because as you said, like, Enfys Nest is supposed to be, the leader of this marauding force, and even the music like builds that up, where there's a great like theme with like a choir for for the band of mercenaries, and it creates like this antagonistic feeling where like these are the the enemies that our heroes are going to be facing throughout the movie, and so you're just not expecting that reveal in the final act. And it's so brilliant the way she just shuts everybody up just by taking that helmet off. And and that once she tells her story, it's not even a question for Han. He immediately is like, well, it's clear what we have to do. And even at first glance, it looks like Beckett is on the same page. Of course, he has an ulterior motive, which leads us into a bunch of really fun reversals. But still, the point is like it's like a sea change at that moment. And she makes an amazing impact, and that this is what I've been talking about the whole stream. So much potential for this movie to be a springboard to other things that thus far has only, it's only been tapped a little bit, and they need to get on that.
Yes, they do. They do indeed. Anyway, I thank you for letting me wax poetic about Enfys, because I just, everyone has those characters that might not be the most most prominent in all the movies, but that you just feel like that strong sense of love for. And for me, Enfys is one of those characters. I just think that she is an outstanding concept, made out an outstanding reality by the way that she is written and embodied by Erin Kellyman. And I can't say enough good things about her. I just love her to death.
Hey, we spent like 25 minutes on Maul, who has a much smaller part in this movie than Enfys Nest. So I'd say bring it on. So and then, as I mentioned, there's this stuff with oh God, why do I keep blanking? Woody Harrelson's character. What I just said.
Beckett.
Beckett. It's so funny. I'm really finding that I'm starting to have that old age kick in whenever I do my live streams. I always know everybody's name, when I'm just conversing with someone about Star Wars. But when I get on the stream, it's like, who was that character whose name I've said 15 billion times? But no, I love the stuff with Beckett when, like when he realizes he's been had by Han, and the reversal happens, and he's like, so the real coaxium, and then Han says, leaves with one of us, and he's like, and then he shoots the guards. Levin's like, what are you doing? And he goes, I'm an entrepreneur. You of all people should be able to understand that, Dryden.
Yeah. He is fantastic, and I love when Dryden's you're making a mistake. He's like, wouldn't be my first. And he's like, it's gonna be your last. Like, maybe. Why are you gonna be so negative?
There is nobody like Woody Harrelson, and like I felt this way for years, especially when he popped up in the Hunger Games. I was like, it's such a pleasure to see him getting to, and you know, his acting chops go way back, but I did always have this mentality of him as Woody from Cheers. You know, that's just hard to get away from. But he more and more and more, he really started to not only get roles that allowed him to show off his dramatic chops, but these like big franchise roles. And it just feels like, you know, over the past decade or so, he's really gotten a lot of respect that he probably always deserved. And so it's a delight to see him and stuff with this, where he really gets to, you know, flex, you know, his acting chops. And, you know, like I said before, his death scene is so touching, where, you know, it's like, I really was gonna learn how to play that Valakor. You know, it's just great.
Yeah, that's why that beat works. You know, the fact that Han chooses to shoot him, but then immediately runs to him and like holds his hand and, you know, comforts him with the idea, you know, so like Rio had mentioned earlier in the movie, you know, it's no good to die alone. And here Beckett is kind of dying alone because of the choices that he made. But even though Han killed him, Han doesn't want him to be alone in those final moments, and that is the difference between the two of them. And I love that Beckett acknowledges that. He's like, made the right choice for once. I would have killed you. And he's essentially acknowledging that, you know, this is where my journey ends, but you are going to go on and make your own way in the galaxy. And ultimately, we will, as we see, Han's way proves to be, you know, for lack of a better term, the right way, because of the impact, the incredibly positive impact he winds up having on the galaxy as a whole.
Yeah, and it's just, it's so good. Would Beckett Beckett wouldn't have joined up with the Rebel Alliance, but I find it endearing that that's, you know, that it's kind of his legacy, you know, that you know, he passes some things on to Han and teaches him some lessons, maybe not entirely the lessons he intends, because I think to Beckett, he'd like to impart to Han to not trust anybody, to sort of, you know, go it alone. But it's Val's influence that's like, no, you shouldn't go it alone. But there is a part of, you know, he's, you know, part of the building blocks of what ultimately makes Han who he is. And it's not so much what he's intending to teach, but what he's indirectly teaching, and the fact that Han feels compelled in that moment to be there with him, you know, in his final moments. That's ultimately part of what gets passed down and allows Han to become who he ultimately is. But then, of course, there's the sting immediately after that of, you know, of Kira leaving, and so in Han's mind, that, you know, I'm sure that makes the other part of what Beckett had been saying to him, you know, sort of stick with him in that moment of, you know, again, I'd love to know what's going on in Han's mind at that moment. Is it, oh, Beckett was right, or is he trying to rationalize what she's doing in that moment? Or
I would love to know as well, because I'm sure his heart is breaking. I'm sure he's feeling, you know, confused and tormented and sad. But there is a saving grace, and I was just about to reference this shot. And the part of the reason that he doesn't become that way is because of the one major character that we have referenced but have not fully given his due yet from this movie.
Oh, you're right.
And that is the mighty Chewbacca. Because
I feel so terrible for the fact that we referenced him, but we haven't really talked about Chewbacca.
Well, you know what? I feel like Chewie, being the magnanimous soul that he is, would be okay with, you know, us saving him for last. But, you know, he just, you know, at least until the end of episode 9. So, but we're going to give him his medal now, because he is an essential and wonderful part of this movie. And as as Kira says, you know, before she, you know, one of the last things that she says to Han before they separate is, you know, go save Chewbacca. You're going to need him and he's going to need you. And, you know, that, you know, and that could not be more true. You know, they are the other than arguably maybe R2D2 and C3PO, Han and Chewbacca, you know, you can't separate the two of them, man. Even in death, they are just, you know, Chewie is loyal to the end, and the fact, like, throughout this movie, like, we get, you know, that was another element. We're like, oh, are we going to see when Han meets Chewbacca for the first time? And they did it in a kind of an unexpected way. I don't think many of us would have had Han getting thrown into a pit on Minban and being potential food for Chewbacca as the origin story for their but it works.
By the way, I love the term Kishitian moof milker. Oh God, so great. No, he's just, it's wonderful. And even though, like, Alden Ehrenreich brings so much to Han prior to that, it really does feel like when he gets thrown in there and Chewbacca gets revealed, there's something about the movie that clicks into place in that moment. Because really, Han Solo is not Han Solo unless he's got Chewbacca. You know, there's just like something about that pairing that, like, it's a critical part of his character, especially. I think we can have Chewbacca on on his own, and he feels, you know, like he's pretty good on his own, but like Han does feel like an incomplete character without Chewie standing right there next to him. And of course, I love the whole Chewbacca. Well, you're gonna need a nickname because I ain't saying that every time.
Yeah, that scene after they escape Mimban and they're arriving on Vandor, where and Chewie kind of comes down the stairs and they're standing next to each other talking about, you know, freedom and what they're going to do with it, and the music that plays during that scene, Flying with Chewie, might be my favorite piece of music on this entire awesome soundtrack. It just, from the moment I heard it in the theater, I was like, I need to know what this track is called because I'm going to be playing it a lot in the future. But the way that they set it up, where he is, you know, it's been mostly comedic up until this point, where, you know, Han is, you know, trying to fend off being drowned in the mud and eaten, and then he gets out of it by literally speaking Wookiee, which was another thing that, or Shirawook, I should say, excuse me.
I speak a little.
I speak a little. And then, you know, they manage to fight their way out, and then there's the funny scene where, you know, Chewie steps into the shower and Han's like, we couldn't have done this like maybe one at a time. But the moment that their relationship truly crystallizes is on that scene on Vandor where, you know, Han is talking to him, like, when's the last time you could say you were free? And then he asks Chewie, you know, what his name is, and, you know, Chewbacca gives his answer, and Han's like, well, you're going to need a nickname because I ain't saying that every time. And the moment that, you know, immediately sprang to mind when I saw that was, you know, from the eternal cinematic classic Casablanca. I just couldn't help but think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. and one that will last for the rest of Han's life, you know, possibly the most enduring relationship.
You mentioned that piece of music. It's really a tall order for a composer to come into this and first of all be like, okay, so John Williams is composing a new theme for Han Solo, so that has to be like, that's going to be part of the score, probably overshadowing anything I do. But also, we're going to bring in a bunch of his other thematic work for scenes like the Kessel Run, and you know, we're going to have, you know, some touches of Duel of the Fates when Darth Maul shows up, and you know, John Williams is such a big part of this score that any composer, you know, would be intimidating to be like, is any of my original material really going to shine through? And it's a testament to John Powell and his skills that not only does he adapt the Williams material brilliantly, but he has some incredibly strong themes that he brings. That the theme for Han and Chewbacca, that piece of music that plays there, it's beautiful. I mentioned the Enfys Nest music, which is very different from John Williams' style. But my personal favorite piece of the entire film is the love theme for Han and Kira, which is just beautiful, which gives me an excuse to throw up some more of the closet pictures, because and then there's, like I said, the classic romantic movie kiss that we get, where the music really kicks in, and it's just this sweeping romantic music that is just so gorgeous, and that's all John Powell, and the fact that stuff, all those themes really stand out, and what he does even with the Williams material. I think that John Williams crafted a beautiful concert piece with his Han Solo theme for this film, but I dare say I think that what John Powell does with that theme is even better, because he does it in a way that's because he has a slightly different style from Williams, and I think the way that he uses and adapts that theme throughout the movie is what really brings the beauty of it. This is my elongated way of just really giving John Powell his due, because the music of this film is utterly brilliant, and I am glad that John Williams got to compose a theme for Han, just like I'm glad he got to compose a theme for Obi-Wan, for the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. And I'd love to see John Powell come back to compose more music for Star Wars, because he's personally my, it's not a competition, but but he probably did my favorite job of taking Williams and adapting it and creating his own themes. I think that the soundtrack is probably my favorite of the non-Williams film soundtracks.
Yep.
And yes, I do have the soundtrack right here, which, even though I bought it off of iTunes the night I saw the movie, yes, I ordered the CD, and this is going to be my moment to plug Entrada Records, who in a couple months time, at some point in the next couple months, should be putting out the expanded soundtrack on CD. So yeah, be sure, people who are interested in film music, keep your ear to the ground for that one. But yeah, so that's just everything about the music was utterly brilliant in this film, and I think it's in a film with a lot of high points, that's pretty damn near the top, in my opinion.
Yeah, he is an outstanding composer for, again, someone I really was not familiar with before this movie, but he took an incredibly difficult task and made something truly, awesome out of it. And I would love to see him come back in any Star Wars project. I can think of the one I would like him to do the most. Possibly, a movie called, I don't know, let's throw it out there, Solo 2?
Hashtag
we can workshop that.
No, I have to say, I was familiar with him before this, and I was really looking forward to see what he was going to do. I'm sure you've probably seen. Have you ever seen How to Train Your Dragon?
Oh yeah, no, I just didn't really associate him with that as much.
Yeah.
Well, as soon as I came back to it, I was like, oh yeah, of course I've heard him before. But
yeah, no, he's one of those. He's one of those composers that, he doesn't do the big, splashy, orchestral sound all the time. He did something very different with the Bourne Identity films. But when he does do it, he's phenomenal at it. he's like, you think about, well, who are some of the successors to like the John Williams and the Jerry Goldsmiths and stuff like that. And John Powell is definitely one of them. He's phenomenal, and which all the more shocking because I often deride even though I love him as a composer, but I often do deride the sort of the Hans Zimmer school of scoring because he has a lot of proteges who tend to follow his example and style, and it just seems like that sound has overrun Hollywood movies. But John Powell was a protege of Hans Zimmer, and he's an example of a composer who has really charted his own path, and he has a very unique style all his own. And so I'm always excited when I see his name, and he did a great job. Anyway, I think I've gone on about the music quite enough.
We knew you cannot talk about a Star Wars movie without talking about the music, so we budgeted for that in our conversation. That I was going to gush about Memphis Nest, and you were going to gush about the music, and now we're all happy.
Yes. Is there anything that we didn't talk about?
I mean, I could talk about this movie forever, but I feel like we've now covered the basic bits that I wanted to make absolutely sure we hit. I would have felt absolutely criminal if we hadn't talked about Chewbacca. So I'm like, we must get that in before the end of the stream.
I do want to mention on the subject of Chewbacca, because just to make sure we definitely do give him his due. I love the stuff with him on Kessel when he discovers that, his people have, I mean, not discovered, I'm sure he already knows, but he sees, some of his people enslaved on Kessel, and for him that becomes the priority. And, and he has to go save them. And Han, after a little bit of bickering, he understands that, and he even gives him his weapon. He's, but then after that, when Chewbacca makes the decision, he has to, go with Han to, because he feels that he has, a debt to pay him, and and he feels connected to him, and I love that bit. I think I have. Oh, where's the picture? Yeah, this is where Chewbacca is kind of saying goodbye to the other Wookiee. And
yeah, I'm so glad you brought that moment up, because not only is it a powerful moment for Chewbacca, I think it's an essential one, because one of the things that we've always heard about Han and Chewbacca is the reason that Chewbacca is so loyal to him is that he has a life debt to Han. Something that he swore to Chew. He swore to to essentially stay with him for as long as possible, and not spend as much time with his wife Mala and his son Lumpy on Kashyyyk, which is always a funny thing to think about, but it is what it is. Watch the Star Wars Holiday Special.
Is that in reference to something that I'm having a hard time canonically remembering?
Yeah, well, it's not canon, but the characters are. The characters have been in canon since. But specifically, what I was mentioning is, we know that Chewie has this life debt to Han, and that is something, we figured we would see in this movie. And they do kind of, Han does kind of save Chewbacca in that scene in Mimban, coming up with a plan to help them escape and break out. But Chewie also kind of saves Han, they essentially kind of work together. And you're like, is that the moment that they really, he decides, I need to swear a life debt to this man? I wouldn't really say it is. It's the moment, because it's kind of the, they kind of talk about the idea that, like, we're going to get some money and then we're going to be free and maybe potentially go our separate ways. I really think it's the moment in the Spice Mines of Keshel that you referenced, where they're in the midst of this incredibly dangerous heist, and Chewie sees his people who have been horribly brutalized and enslaved all across the galaxy, and he feels just compelled to help them, as he should. And Han is ostensibly focused on the mission, but then he makes the incredibly brave and compassionate choice to let Chewie go, and to do that, and to save his people, even if it might mean that he fails in his own mission. And Chewie ends up rewarding that loyalty, coming back and saving him, and that's the moment where I really feel like the two characters, start to understand and bond with one another. And that's where their relationship, becomes cemented to the point that they become this immortal, iconic duo.
Yeah, and I love there's also that moment when when they're breaking in, when Chewie rips the arms.
that is such
that guy is like, yeah, that uniform would have fit me perfectly, but that's all right. And Chewie's just like,
yep.
No,
this is such a. You might be able to tell from the amount we've quoted. This is probably one of the funniest Star Wars movies.
Yeah. God, yeah. It's just so much fun. I just and I've been glad to discover other people like yourself who really enjoy this movie as well, because sometimes a lot of the time you think, well, could it just have been the way that I saw it? And I did see this movie in a very unique way. I talked about how, it was a late night showing at an ArcLight Cinemas. I was on vacation, having a good time. So you're predisposed to be in a good mood. But it just was one of the most joyous, Star Wars experiences that I've had, especially in the cinema. And so it's been nice to see this sort of almost underground movement of love for this movie, and the whole hashtag make Solo 2 happen movement.
Shout out to the Resistance broadcast who coined that.
Yeah. So it's, I do hope that all those efforts see fruition, and that one day we see a continuation of a lot of the elements in this movie. But you know what? If not, it's I look at this movie as almost like a really, special secret handshake. Like, if a if a Star Wars movie can be a cult favorite, then this is definitely it. And it's nice to know that that love is shared, amongst the group of people. So
yeah, it's truly, to the extent that the Star Wars movie, as we said at the beginning of the stream, can be like an underrated gem. I feel like a lot of the Star Wars movies are underrated for very different reasons, but the fact that this was the one movie that people feel like comfortable labeling like a failure, mainly because they didn't make enough money at the box office, I feel is so misrepresentative. And also the fact that, there was a very loud, shall we say, contingent of people before this movie was released that were like, why do we quote unquote need a young Han Solo story? And this is possibly my least favorite argument about anything, because I'm like, why did we need any movie? Like, when the fans are like, we didn't ask for this, I'm like, well, nobody asked for most of the great movies in the world that have been made. So please, for the love of God, retire that trash argument forever. But in this case, it was just, it creates almost an underdog kind of quality for it, where it was like, you know what? Guess what? Despite everything, despite having to replace the directors and, reshoot most of the movie and all the trouble and with all the marketing, this movie got made, and it exists now and forever, and it's really damn good. And those of us who are willing to, engage with it rather than just be like, oh, we heard that one, didn't make money, it's probably not worth seeing. Like, if you watch this movie, and are willing to like open your heart to it, as I feel like you should try to do with every movie you watch. But in this case, I feel like it will reward you if you go into it with that idea, because this is a movie that truly wears its heart on its sleeve.
Yeah, and it has the distinction of actually being the only Star Wars film which within the actual film itself bears the full title that includes a Star Wars story. because Rogue One in the actual film is simply titled Rogue One.
Yeah.
And so Solo will kind of stand out as, for better or for worse. Like, it'll always be the experiment film that unfortunately, things went a different way. But at the same time, it's, this whole Star Wars story thing is, we can look back on it now and people can say, oh, that experiment was a failure. But I think they still would have tried for it if Disney Plus hadn't become a thing, and they hadn't been able to then redirect their focus onto doing these kinds of stories in the television medium, which I think is, I like what this film is able to achieve scale-wise by being a film, but I do acknowledge that it's easier for these stories to be told in the television medium because there's not so much scrutiny. But there's still a lot of scrutiny, as we've seen. But they don't have to deal with it's took in this much money at the box office and all that crap. So I do think that both Rogue One and this film led to the Star Wars television series. And without, and like we were talking about before, the whole thing with Maul and that reveal was a big harbinger of, like, the scope of storytelling we were going to get, and the fact that, that was so groundbreaking. But now, the next episode of Star Wars television is going to be Ahsoka and Anakin together, and it's just mind-boggling. So I think the legacy of this film does live on, even if we haven't gotten the sort of direct continuations of things that we would like to have. But as we mentioned before, I think that's still on the table. I think the reason why we haven't gotten the Kira and Maul story in a comic or in a book is because they still plan on telling that story on screen. So I don't think this part of the storytelling has been abandoned. I think they're just waiting for the right time when they can tackle it again. And even though it's probably the thing that, that is most on the back burner just because of the advances they've made with this, the CGI, versions like of Luke and stuff, I still very much hope to one day see Alden Ehrenreich return as Han Solo, because I think he gave us a great Han. And honestly, I'd love to see what another young actor could bring to Luke, because I think there's only so much we can get from the CGI Mark Hamill.
I mean, honestly, like it's an aside, but like the actor who acts as Luke's stand-in looks pretty much like young Luke. They barely even need to do anything. Yeah. But yeah, Solo came out at a very interesting time for all with Star Wars. There's never not an interesting time, but it was the fact that it came out between the last two movies in the Skywalker saga and a year before Disney Plus was, going to become a thing. It was a movie truly that only could have been made when it was made, or it would have looked different. It's well documented, proven, in fact, that, the Obi-Wan Kenobi television series was supposed to be originally a movie and would have been a movie if, as you say, they hadn't gone forward with Disney Plus, and perhaps if Solo had performed a little bit better at the box office. Ultimately, I love what we got with the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. I know that some people feel like it's clear that it was stretched out and probably could have been condensed down to a 2-hour movie. And conversely, I think Solo probably could have, if these two had been flipped, Solo probably could have been stretched out into a 6-part Disney Plus series. Mm-hmm. But I love the movie that we have. I think that it actually is very well suited to this format, not just for budgetary reasons, as you mentioned, and the fact that we get to see incredible things like the Vandor train heist sequence, which I love, and the Kessel Run, and that final confrontation on Dryden's yacht, the first flight, like just with the full power of a Star Wars movie budget behind it, makes it that much more special. But if the story has to continue on a Disney Plus series going forward, what matters most are the characters that this film created, and they will remain, indelible. Both characters that we knew before, like Han and Lando, and the new characters like Kira and Enfys. And hopefully we will have the opportunity to see them tell stories like that either whether it's an animation or live action. It's just something that I feel like they can't let that opportunity pass by. And I do have faith because, we have seen the prequel renaissance, as it were, when Disney originally bought Star Wars. There were very few references to the prequels, which I was upset about and was something I struggled with at the time. And now we're just in essentially nirvana for the prequel generation. And I fully believe that the sequel trilogy will have such a moment, and Solo will have such a moment at some point in time. And hell, what if they wait long enough? And Alden Ehrenreich, has to age himself up a few years, he'd be perfect to play Han Solo in Dave Filoni's New Republic movie. So.
Yeah, it's interesting how things can change quickly. It's like with The Force Awakens, oh my God, there can be no mention of the prequels whatsoever. And then just 2 years later, Last Jedi, we're mentioning Darth Sidious.
Yeah.
It's, and the fall of the Jedi, and how, and they were full of hubris and stuff, which were direct callbacks to the prequels. And then, a couple of years after that, we were swimming in the stuff. We have a trilogy of Padme novels, it's like crazy. Although we are still waiting for Padme, at least a freaking name drop or something, and, in these shows, which the only egregious, thing with that was the fact that we went through a whole Obi-Wan Kenobi series and they talked about Padme, but they didn't mention her by name. It's like, really?
Yeah.
Justice for Padme.
Justice for Padme.
Yeah. On the subject of like what was made into a movie and what was made into a television series, the one thing I will say about, I'm glad we got every bit of Obi-Wan Kenobi that we got. That said, it would have been really awesome to see that movie with a movie budget.
Mm-hmm.
It just, because you did feel sometimes like, well, this is on a smaller soundstage, and but what helped with that was the fact that it was very much a prequel story, and
Mm-hmm.
we've been used to the fact that the prequels were done, with so much pioneering use of green screen and all that. So the fact that that's sort of the style that we got with Obi-Wan Kenobi, but much better with using the volume and stuff, it still sort of felt like a natural evolution of that prequel storytelling, in the best possible way. So I'm like, I don't feel too bad about that we lost out on a lot, but at the same time, I looked at Solo and I'm like, the budget is definitely there. You can see it. And so, but that's, you were talking about that earlier. It's like the road not taken. It's like, we can spend all day going on about that, but what we got is what we got. And for the prospect of future continuations of this story, I'm glad in a way that maybe it wasn't one of the first things they did for television out of the gate, because I do feel like they've been learning a lot with their use of the volume. And I'm spellbound by some of the stuff we've gotten in Ahsoka so far versus like the very early days of The Mandalorian, which was still great considering it was their first show out. But you can definitely tell where they've stepped up their game and in how they worked with the technology and what they've learned. So yeah, a lot of Ahsoka feels very big and epic, which I've been happy about. And so once again, I'm just going to go into my excitement for this Tuesday. Because
3 or 4 more days, man. I'm right there with you.
Okay, so I think we covered just about everything we can think of, and we're just under 3 hours. So we've gotten back.
Yeah, you were mentioning last week. You're like, I got, or a couple weeks ago, I was like, I need to work myself back up to these 3-hour streams. You know, we're getting there. We're getting there. We need a Keira Knightley movie to truly, you know, go over 3 hours. So
well, we've got essentially 3 movies to talk about in one stream in 2 weeks. So I think that will be a piece of cake. We'll definitely go over 3 hours for that one. Any final comments you want to make about the movie before we wrap up?
No, just that I love it. I mean, I love all Star Wars movies, all 11 of them, all the live action TV shows that we have, all the animated shows that we have, and I love them all for similar reasons, and I love them all for the reasons that make them all unique. And Solo is a unique, you know, gem of a movie, and I don't love ranking Star Wars movies. I really, especially because it shifts constantly. And I feel like whenever I try to put together my ranking for Star Wars movies just in my own head, I feel like Solo always ends up like relatively low just because I love the other movies so much. And then I watch it like I did yesterday and I'm like, gosh, damn, this movie is good. It is so fun. It is so like powerful and meaningful to me. And I love it so much. So I'm very happy I got a chance to talk about it with you. And I will be rewatching it sooner rather than later.
Yeah. I know our rankings, or at least our attempt at rankings, do differ a bit. I know that I think we're in reverse order with the sequel trilogy. I think, because for me, I absolutely, and I know you like it as well. You know, but I think it's your third favorite of that trilogy. But for me, The Force Awakens is just pure magic. So I always have a hard time like placing, is Force Awakens or is this one my favorite Star Wars movie of the Disney era? And it usually depends on whatever is the last one I watched, most recently. So today it's Solo. But if I watch Force Awakens later, I'll text you. I'll be like, nope, I changed it again.
It's beautiful. For me, Rise of Skywalker is and always will be number one of this era. But Solo is it is probably the movie that I find the most purely rewatchable of all the Star Wars movies. And part of that, what's helpful is the fact that it's not a Skywalker saga film, and the other anthology film, Rogue One, is so closely tied to New Hope that oftentimes if I watch one of them, I feel this like burning compulsion to go and watch the next one. But Solo, in its own way, kind of stands alone. And for the character, and I didn't even realize I made the Solo alone pun there. We didn't even touch about how he got his name, which I thought I was going to hate, and I actually love the way it's done in the movie.
Oh, a lot of people hate it. I actually like it, but
I do too, because he ultimately chooses to make that name his own. It's a case of choice and found family, which is a recurring theme throughout all the Star Wars movies. But Solo in particular is just something that I know I can just put on and I know we'll have a great time with it. And then at the end, I feel very satisfied and don't feel the need to, immediately jump to the next movie until Solo 2 is made. And then I will feel the need to jump to that next movie. So get on that, First pay your writers, then pay your actors, and then get your asses in gear and make Solo 2.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think and that's the thing. Like if it had come even a year later, it probably would have ended up as a Disney Plus series. And it's part of the reason why I love it so much, the fact that we got a Star Wars movie where the stakes were not saving the universe. It's a heist movie and it's about the personal relationships, and that's what's on the line, for the movie. Um, and the fact that we got that from such a huge franchise. And that's why I always tell people, like, when it comes to these kinds of movies and comic book films, it's like my favorites are usually the ones that, even if they are telling a big, save the universe, or if it's an X-Men movie, save the mutant race or whatever, if the core of the movie is more personal, if it's about this relationship is on the line, or where the rest of the world will be just fine, but it's this particularly, like saving this group of people. Those tend to be my favorite, because when the stakes are, I don't even want to say when the stakes are lower, because the stakes are still high for these characters, but when it's just not end of the world scenarios, it's it has the potential to be much more emotionally rich. And that's why, especially as I've gotten older over the years, like those are definitely the stories that register with me. And this may be the only time we get a story like that, because I feel like anything on this scale in the future will be a Disney Plus series. But who knows? Things change.
We shall see.
Yeah.
I'll be ready for it whenever and wherever it comes.
Yeah. All right. So we made it over the 3-hour mark.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of happy about that, because I feel like Solo, it was organic. We just wanted to talk about this movie, and the fact that this was a last minute stream and we managed to still gush about this movie for 3 hours. I'm very satisfied.
It'll make this the Solo of the streams, because it'll be the underrated gem that a few people watched, but that was a lot of fun. But yeah, so with that, we'll wrap it up. A beautiful film, a fun movie, and definitely one of my favorites of the franchise. I know we had a couple people pop in, throughout the stream. So thank you for those of you who were here. And thank you for anybody who will come to it later. If you've actually decided to come back later and sit through all 3 hours, thank you very, very much. That's a tall order. But yeah, so next week we'll be diving back into Ahsoka, and we'll be seeing the return of Anakin Skywalker, which I'm very excited about. And then the week after that, our good friend Ari will be joining us for the Pirates of the Caribbean anniversary stream. The first movie is 20 years old, and I feel old. But that'll be a lot of fun, because it'll be the three of us trying to make time for other things in those movies aside from just Keira Knightley. But I'm just going to label it a Knights of Keira stream, because that's what it's going to be. So yeah, so be prepared for that. And yeah, I think that'll about do it. Thank you, everybody, once again. Thank you, Jared. I had a blast. This was a lot of fun. And yeah, and we'll see you guys next week.
All right. Take care.